Hello, my dear friends. They call it medicine, but in the Middle Ages, laudanum caused men and women to gradually collapse until they had no strength left to live. In the village, in the church, or at the market, it was sold openly. Anyone could buy it, and anyone could use it. Relatives watched their families fall apart. Children sat silently watching, and monks did not know how to explain when many died suddenly. History books do not record them, but the consequences they left behind still linger. Tonight, we will go into the horrifying lives of laudanum addicts in the Middle Ages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you believed laudanum was introduced into medieval life with suspicion and fear, you would be mistaken, because it arrived praised as medicine. It was no secret potion hidden in dark corners, but a liquid openly prepared by healers and trusted in homes. The substance was a mixture of alcohol and resin drawn from the poppy. When combined, it formed a dark, bitter solution that could be poured into a cup or mixed with broth. People did not see danger in it. They saw a possibility. For them, life was full of pain, and any chance to soften it was worth taking. Laudanum came as a cure for bodies already worn by hard labour, poor food, and constant illness. That is why it was welcomed so quickly. Healers recommended it for complaints that touched nearly every family. A man with rotting teeth was given laudanum to numb his jaw. A woman kept awake through long nights of restlessness drank it to sleep. A child sick with nausea or stomach pain swallowed it when herbs did nothing. The same liquid was poured again and again for different ailments, and each time the result felt immediate. Pain was dulled, anxiety faded, stomach cramps eased. Families believed they had found a true medicine at last. The healers who offered it enjoyed the respect that came with such results. They believed they were helping. Their patients believed it too. From the start, laudanum carried the image of a miracle. People did not have the language to describe chemical dependency. They only knew what they felt. When the liquid entered the body, there was quiet. Muscles relaxed. Eyes grew heavy. The body seemed at peace. In a world with little relief, that was enough to make it sacred. It is almost amusing that the same substance praised as a blessing was the one that slowly created a new form of suffering. But at the beginning, no one thought of that. They thought only of how much better life seemed after taking it. In homes built of wood and stone, bottles of laudanum sat beside jars of honey or vinegar. It was used as casually as herbs, though its effects were far stronger. Mothers reached for it when children could not stop crying. Labourers drank it after working in the fields from dawn to dusk. Elders used it to calm the aches of stiff joints. The bitterness of its taste was often covered with sweeteners, so it became easier to swallow. The routine was simple and repeated without thought. That repetition made it ordinary, and once ordinary, it no longer raised questions. Medicine became a habit. The monasteries also gave laudanum legitimacy. Monks copied recipes into their books and handed out doses to pilgrims who came in pain, stored in glass jars, measured carefully. It was described in their records as useful for nearly every discomfort. Because monks were seen as men of learning, their acceptance of laudanum made the substance even more respected. No one doubted something that the church allowed and healers praised. A patient who left calmer was enough proof that it worked. No one stayed long enough to see the slow toll it took. Laudanum's ability to touch many parts of life made it indispensable. A soldier injured in a skirmish could dull his agony with it. A mother in childbirth could endure with its help. A farmer with a bad back could find the strength to finish the harvest. A noble with fevers or headaches could rest in comfort. The same bottle passed through many hands, and in each case it was seen as a gift. Compared to modern times, when medicines are wrapped in warnings and taken with caution, their casual use feels like leaving the front door open and expecting nothing to enter. What interests me is how little hesitation people showed in trusting it. They accepted it quickly, almost too quickly. They believed in its power because they needed to believe in something. Pain was constant. Illness was everywhere. Death was always near. If a liquid could create even a moment of peace, then it was taken without question. The fact that it did not cure the cause of suffering did not matter. It removed the sensation, and that was enough. I cannot help but notice how human it is to cling to relief, even when that relief carries its danger. The story of laudanum's beginning is simple. It was a mixture made from familiar materials, prescribed for common complaints, and embraced as a miracle. That simplicity gave it power. People did not fear it, so they used it often. They did not limit it, so it spread quickly. They did not question it, so it became part of life. In every village and every household, laudanum became another item on the shelf, waiting to be poured whenever pain appeared. And in those early days, no one doubted that it was the right thing to do. But cures that arrive too easily often bring hidden costs. What made laudanum truly dangerous was not only what it did to the body, but how easily it could be found, waiting for anyone who reached out a hand. Laudanum in medieval times did not remain a secret confined to the shelves of healers or the cupboards of monasteries. It spread outward into the daily market stalls where bread, meat, and salt were sold. Merchants carried it in bottles beside spices and oils. Monks who had learned to prepare it passed jars to those who asked for help. Apothecaries lined their tables with it in plain view. There was nothing hidden about its presence. It was as available as any other commodity. People who passed through the square could see it, ask for it, and buy it without trouble. That openness created a sense of safety. If something was offered so freely, then surely it could not be dangerous. At least, that is how most people thought. The process of buying laudanum was simple. A few coins exchanged hands, and the liquid was yours. No priest asked for confession before selling it. No guard stood to regulate the trade. Farmers leaving with sacks of grain might also tuck a small vial into their pockets. Noble families who sent servants to the market added bottles to their regular purchases. Even travellers passing through could pick up a supply without needing introductions or special permissions. There were no licenses for sellers, no questions asked about why it was needed, and no record kept of how much was taken home. The ease of access was both its strength and its curse. It is almost ridiculous that something so powerful was traded with the same casualness as a loaf of bread. That accessibility shaped the way laudanum was seen. It became less of a medicine reserved for specific illnesses and more of a household item. Families stocked it beside jars of honey, vinegar, or wine. Bottles rested on shelves in peasant cottages and in noble halls alike. Because it was easy to buy, people stopped considering whether it should be used sparingly. They reached for it in moments of mild discomfort, not only for severe pain. A sleepless night, a nervous mood, or a simple headache could all be reasons to pour a spoonful. With no warnings attached, the assumption grew that it was harmless if used often. Over time, this assumption planted the seeds of widespread dependence. The role of monks and healers also reinforced its availability. Religious men prepared laudanum in their workshops and handed it to pilgrims who came seeking help. They did not hide it behind locked doors. Their approval gave it legitimacy. Villagers believed that if holy men distributed it, then it must be safe. Healers sold it without rationing doses, pleased to see patients return for more. Their reputation grew because their treatment seemed effective. They were not accused of harm, only praised for relief. In their minds, laudanum was part of their duty to ease suffering. They had no reason to limit its reach. That lack of caution allowed the substance to spread even further. One of the most striking aspects of this stage is that laudanum crossed every boundary of class. The wealthy bought it in bulk, stocking their cupboards with bottles. Servants used it quietly after long days of work. Farmers in the fields had access to it when they visited town. Children drank it when parents thought it might calm restlessness. Even the elderly who rarely travelled could obtain it through relatives or neighbours. The spread was complete because the supply was everywhere. No law restricted who could buy it. No priest condemned who could use it. It was part of daily trade, as ordinary as flour or cheese. Compared to today, when even simple medicine requires prescriptions and labels, the medieval world feels like a marketplace where every gate was left wide open. The absence of regulation is what truly sets the stage for dependence. No one measured doses carefully. A seller might suggest a spoonful, but families often adjusted amounts on their own. Some poured more when the pain felt stronger. Others diluted it for children but still gave it regularly. Because no warning signs were written or spoken, people assumed it was safe at any level. They did not think in terms of overdose. They did not imagine the possibility of lasting harm. Their trust came from the open nature of the trade. Nothing that was sold so freely could possibly be dangerous, or so they believed. The result was that laudanum began to enter households where it was not always needed. Families purchased bottles just in case. They kept them ready for any minor discomfort. The presence of laudanum in cupboards meant that it was always within reach. Once within reach, it was used more often. People did not think about whether they truly required it. They thought about how easy it was to take. A sip for nerves before bed, a drop for mild aches, another spoon for fatigue. Over time, this casual consumption created reliance. Yet the reliance did not appear alarming because everyone was doing the same. In a village where nearly every home had a bottle, no one thought of it as unusual. What stands out to me is how society at large accepted this without pause. They celebrated laudanum as part of progress in healing. They welcomed its presence in markets and monasteries. They ignored the signs that some were already showing dependence. I cannot help but think that they lived in an illusion of safety, created only because laudanum was easy to buy and easy to hide behind the mask of medicine. That illusion allowed the substance to move deeper into lives than it ever should have. The danger of easy access is not only in the medicine itself, but in the way people behave when boundaries are absent. With laudanum, no one was told to stop. No one was guided to limit its use. Without barriers, consumption spreads naturally, the way water spreads when walls are broken. Villages that once saw it as rare soon treated it as ordinary. Nobles who once trusted in exotic remedies now trusted in this dark liquid. Monks who once gave herbs to pilgrims now gave laudanum more freely. Step by step, the substance passed through every hand and settled into every corner of a life. By the time anyone might have wondered whether laudanum was too common, it was already too late. The market stalls were full, the cupboards were stocked, the people were accustomed. Easy access had created expectation, and expectation had created dependence. The doors were open, and the substance had walked into nearly every home. That was the path that would shape the darker story still to come. The real danger of such easy access was not only that laudanum filled cupboards and markets, but that it began to be poured into the deepest wounds of the mind, offered as comfort for grief and despair. The wounds of the mind were often suppressed with laudanum. It was no longer seen only as a remedy for broken bones, aching teeth, or restless nights. It was given to people who carried grief and despair. Women who lost children were among the first to be handed the dark liquid. Their sorrow was not treated with conversation or comfort, but with a spoonful of medicine that dulled the heart as much as it dulled the body. A mother mourning her child might close her eyes after drinking, and for a few hours she would be silent. Families believed this silence meant relief. They saw calmness where there had been cries, and they mistook it for healing. The truth was that her grief was only pressed down, waiting to return heavier than before. In villages where war shaped daily life, men returning from the battlefield became common users as well. They carried wounds that bandages could not close. Memories of blood, screams, and loss followed them home. These men struggled to sleep, often restless at night, unable to find peace. Wine could numb them for a short while. but it was laudanum that seemed to give a deeper stillness. The body relaxed, the mind slowed, and the memories faded into haze. Families saw this as progress. A soldier who finally slept was thought to be recovering, yet he was not recovering. He was beginning to rely on something that did not erase his pain but only covered it. It is almost sarcastic to think that the same liquid used to mend the broken spirit was quietly teaching it to remain broken. The pattern extended beyond soldiers and grieving mothers. People who today might be described as depressed or suffering from nervous disorders also turned to laudanum. In the medieval world, there were no names for such conditions. A person who withdrew from others, sat in silence, or cried without reason was seen as weak or cursed. Communities had no understanding of mental illness, only judgments and superstitions. Healers reached for laudanum because it gave the appearance of change. A restless man grew calm. A sleepless woman finally rested. A weeping person became quiet. To those around them, this was evidence of success. Yet what it truly revealed was a growing dependence, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to take hold. Compared to modern times, when therapy, medication, and structured care exist, their reliance on laudanum was like placing a lid on a boiling pot and assuming the fire had gone out. The cycle deepened because the effects of laudanum never lasted. It did not heal sorrow, it only muffled it. When the medicine wore off, the feelings returned, often sharper than before. Grieving mothers felt their emptiness rise again. Soldiers woke with memories even darker than when they had fallen asleep. Villagers with hidden despair found their sadness heavier after each dose. The answer seemed simple to them. They reached for more. Another spoonful, another swallow, another attempt to push the feelings down again. The routine repeated itself until the body demanded it as much as the mind. This was not healing, it was suppression, and suppression became chains. Families watched these changes without understanding. They described the users as fragile, weary, or unlucky. A mother drinking every night was said to be broken by loss. A soldier who could not rest without the bottle was said to be exhausted from war. A villager sunk in despair was said to be cursed by fate. They blamed the person rather than the medicine. Because the word addiction did not exist, they could not recognize what was unfolding. Their answer was to give more, not less. They believed in the cure, so they never questioned whether the cure was the cause of continued suffering. The community's misunderstanding created a tragic acceptance. Laudanum was seen as kindness. To give it was to help. No one meant to trap others in dependence. Mothers were handed it because their pain was unbearable to watch. Soldiers were given it because their restlessness disturbed entire households. Villagers suffering in silence were encouraged to take it so they would not seem strange. The silence it created was praised. Even though it was only temporary, I cannot help but reflect on how easily silence was mistaken for healing, and how willing people were to believe that stillness meant recovery. Because of this, laudanum became the standard answer to emotional pain. It was easier to hand a bottle than to sit with grief. It was easier to prescribe a dose than to face the truth that no medicine could erase the wounds of war or the loss of a child. It became a tool of convenience for healers and families alike. The results looked convincing, but they were illusions. Behind the calm surface, the dependence grew stronger. The body began to expect the medicine, and the mind began to crave it. The cycle had begun, and it was not easily broken. As time passed, entire lives began to revolve around these doses. Mothers took it each night to face the emptiness. Soldiers reached for it when memories returned. Villagers with despair consumed it daily to hold back the weight inside. What had started as compassion became routine. What had started as healing became a habit. Laudanum, once praised as a miracle, was now the center of survival for many. They believed they needed it to keep going, but in truth, it was pulling them deeper into dependency with each passing day. Laudanum was never a cure for the wounds of the mind. It was a mask. It covered grief. It silenced despair. and it blurred memory, but only for a time. When the mask fell away, the wounds remained as raw as before, sometimes worse. Those who lived in this cycle no longer thought of life without the bottle. They measured their days not by sunrise and sunset, but by when the next dose would come. That was the quiet shift, from medicine to necessity, from comfort to control. The path from grief to dependence was shorter than anyone realized. What began as a spoonful to calm sorrow soon became a daily anchor. Families believed they were helping. Healers believed they were treating, but laudanum was creating its illness, one that no one had the knowledge to name. That was how the substance moved from comfort to captivity, one dose at a time. As laudanum became the answer for sorrow, despair, and loss, it also became the center around which entire lives began to spin, turning grief into dependence and dependence into routine. Life for those who had fallen into the grip of laudanum began to change in ways that were hard to miss. At first, the medicine was used only in moments of sorrow or pain, but soon it became part of every waking day. The body adjusted to its presence and refused to function without it. People who once worked steadily in fields, shops, or homes found themselves unable to continue unless they had taken their dose. A farmer who missed it could not lift his tools. A craftsman who skipped it could not hold his instruments. A mother who went without it grew restless and weak. The simple tasks of survival began to depend not on strength or skill, but on whether laudanum was flowing in their veins. The rhythm of work was tied directly to the rhythm of the bottle. A labourer might rise with the sun, but he would not step into the field until he had swallowed his share. A woman preparing bread for her family would not knead the dough until she had quieted her nerves with the dark liquid. Without it, their hands shook, their minds wandered, and their energy disappeared. With it, they felt calm enough to move forward. This pattern meant that life no longer belonged to the individual. It belonged to the medicine. It is almost sarcastic to call them free people when their ability to function depended entirely on a single bottle. Mood swings became another mark of dependence. When the effect of laudanum was present, people seemed calm, even pleasant. Their voices lowered, their movements slowed, and their faces softened. Families described them as easier to live with, more agreeable. But when the effects began to wear away, the changes were sharp. Anxiety returned, tempers flared. Some wept without reason, while others shouted at the smallest disturbance. The cycle created a house filled with sudden calm and sudden storms, depending only on the timing of the dose. Villagers noticed this too. A man who seemed friendly in the morning could be angry by evening. A woman who was quiet and gentle one day could be restless and sharp the next. The shifts were not explained by the medicine. They were explained as mood or fate, but the truth was clear for those who looked closely. Over time, the focus of life narrowed until it revolved entirely around the next dose. Meals were skipped if the bottle was empty. Work was delayed if the liquid was not at hand. Visits to neighbours or trips to markets were shaped by whether laudanum had been taken or whether more needed to be bought. Festivals, prayers, and even family gatherings could not hold attention for someone whose body was craving the drug. The substance stood at the centre of every decision. Other concerns faded. Food, companionship, and even faith took second place. What mattered most was the next measure poured into a cup. This dependence was not seen as shocking at the time. Families accepted it as part of the illness. A man who refused to work without his dose was called weak. A woman who snapped at her children when she had none left was called frail. They were pitied rather than understood. The medicine itself was not questioned. It was still thought of as a gift, a cure, a necessary support. Compared to modern times, when addiction is studied and described with precision, the medieval view feels like watching a village sink into mud while believing it is walking on solid ground. In homes across villages and towns, Routines were structured to ensure the medicine was never out of reach. Bottles were counted, doses measured, supplies replenished. People planned their days around access. A worker might spend part of his wages just to buy more. A mother might trade small goods at the market to secure another bottle. Children learned quickly that their parents were calmer after taking it, and they grew accustomed to watching the ritual of pouring and swallowing. This normalization meant that no one thought it strange. It was simply life, repeated day after day. The consequences for work and community life grew heavier. Fields were left unattended if doses were missed. Shops closed when owners felt too unsteady. Families lost income because members could not function without the drug. In some cases, neighbors stepped in to help, but more often resentment grew. People began to notice that laudanum users contributed less and demanded more. They seemed unreliable, though no one used the word. Their dependence eroded trust and responsibility. What had once been a medicine for healing was now quietly weakening the bonds that held villages together. The psychological trap was as deep as the physical one. People believed they needed laudanum not only to ease pain but to exist at all. The thought of going without it filled them with dread. Some admitted to themselves in private moments that they no longer cared about food, family, or faith as much as they cared about the bottle. The medicine had become more important than their own survival. The fear of not having it overshadowed every other fear. The craving for calm became stronger than the will to live without it. I find it striking how entire lives could shrink down to a single obsession, leaving behind everything else that once gave them meaning. The household that once shared joy now shared dependence. Children learned to live with the changes in mood. Spouses adjusted their routines to avoid conflict when the bottle was empty. Villagers tolerated sudden tempers because they knew the cycle. It became part of the fabric of life. Laudanum was no longer a cure in these homes. It was the master. It dictated when meals were cooked, when work was done, when prayers were said, and when families could rest. That silent shift was visible to anyone who looked closely, yet it went unnamed. By this stage, the lives of addicts no longer revolved around faith, work, or family. They revolved around laudanum. It was the beginning and the end of every day, the measure by which hours were counted, the reason tasks were done or left undone. What had once been a tool to manage pain had become the axis of existence. The person no longer decided. The medicine was decided. That was the transformation that quietly spread through villages, affecting not just individuals but entire communities. And yet, the body cannot endure endless dependence without showing signs of collapse. Even as people lived from dose to dose, the changes in their health began to show. Pale skin, weak limbs, and hollow eyes told a story that laudanum could no longer hide. The body of a laudanum user began to tell a story that words could not. As the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, physical signs of collapse appeared. Skin that once carried colour became pale, sometimes even greyish. The glow of health faded, and was replaced with a sickly hue that no amount of rest or food could restore. Weight fell away quickly, not because of hard work, but because the appetite was gone. Meals were skipped, bread remained untouched, and bowls of soup went cold. Laudanum dulled hunger, and so the body starved even as food was present. People grew thinner until bones pressed against skin. Villagers saw these changes but explained them as weakness or illness rather than recognizing what truly caused them. Eyes were another mark of decline. They sank deeper into the skull, ringed with shadows. The brightness that once reflected life was lost. Some described them as hollow, others as lifeless. Addicts often stared without focus, their gaze wandering past those around them. Families worried, yet they believed it was the result of fatigue or sadness rather than the medicine. They did not connect the failing body to the bottle that was consumed daily. It is almost sarcastic to note how a substance praised for bringing health left its users looking like the very image of sickness. Hands and nails also changed. Nails grew brittle, splitting easily. sometimes breaking off entirely. Fingers shook without reason, making simple tasks difficult. A person who once spun wool or worked wood could no longer control their hands. The small details of appearance also suffered. Hair began to fall out, sometimes in handfuls, leaving thin patches on the scalp. The hair that remained grew dull, lacking the shine of youth. These were not subtle changes. They were visible to everyone, yet they were explained away as aging, stress, or misfortune. Few admitted that the common medicine was behind it all. The slow collapse of the body was masked by the silence surrounding laudanum. Families expected sickness as part of life, so they did not question it. Illness was common in medieval times. People died young, and weakness was often accepted without explanation. If someone grew pale and thin, it was said to be a curse, poor diet, or simply fate. In such a world, the signs of laudanum addiction blended in with the many other sufferings people endured. This is why recognition was so rare. Addicts themselves did not see the connection either. They believed laudanum gave them strength. They could not imagine it was taking more than it gave. The lack of appetite was one of the most damaging effects. Without regular meals, the body could not sustain itself. Muscles wasted, ribs showed, and faces became gaunt. People who had once been strong workers could no longer stand for long hours. Mothers who once cared for households became too weak to lift heavy pots. Children noticed these changes but could not understand them. The home grew quieter as the addict's energy disappeared. Yet the bottle remained in use. The absence of food did not stop the routine of consumption. If anything, the lack of nourishment made the body cling even harder to the drug. The decline was steady and undeniable, but it was rarely linked to laudanum. Families prayed, offered herbs, and called on priests, hoping to ease what they thought was a natural illness. They offered comfort without realizing the real cause. This misunderstanding allowed the cycle to continue. Even as the addict weakened, they continued to drink. The craving remained stronger than hunger, stronger than the will to recover. Compared to modern medicine, which looks closely at side effects and long-term damage, the medieval world seems like a place where people watched bodies collapse while insisting they were only touched by fate. For those inside the spiral, denial was part of survival. They told themselves that their appearance was the result of sorrow, hard work, or simple aging. They could not face the idea that the very thing they trusted was destroying them. The mind refused to see what the mirror showed. Neighbours sometimes whispered, but they too avoided blame. It was easier to explain the decline as a sickness than to accuse the common medicine. And so, pale faces and thin bodies became accepted as normal, even expected. What stands out most to me is how people could look directly at these changes and still fail to see the truth. The signs were written on the skin, in the eyes, in the thinning hair, yet they went unrecognized. I cannot help but reflect on how powerful denial can be when both families and addicts want to believe in a cure, even when the cure is killing them. This shared blindness gave laudanum even more power. It thrived in the silence of misunderstanding. The addicts themselves often hid behind clothing, scarves, and shadows. They avoided bright light and gatherings where their decline would be too obvious. Some learned to speak less, so their trembling voices would not draw attention. Others kept to their homes, avoiding questions from neighbours. Isolation grew as health declined. What began as a tool for healing had turned into a reason for secrecy. Shame crept in quietly, even if the word addiction was unknown. As the body wasted away, the mind still believed the medicine was necessary. Addicts clung to the bottle as if it were their last hope. They did not see that each sip pulled them closer to collapse. They saw only the momentary calm, the easing of nerves, the false sense of stability. The weakness that followed was explained as part of life, never as part of the drug. This illusion kept them trapped until their bodies could no longer endure. In households across villages, the pattern repeated. Pale skin, hollow eyes, brittle nails, Thinning hair, weak limbs, fading voices, wasted bodies. Families accepted these signs as ordinary, never naming the real cause. Communities carried on, blind to what was happening in plain sight. The body was telling the truth, but no one listened. And so the decline deepened, step by step, until the body could no longer hide it. But physical collapse was only one part of the story. As the body failed, the mind began to falter as well, slipping into confusion, hallucinations, and a loss of control that frightened both families and neighbours. The decline of the body was only the beginning. As the months passed and the years wore on, the mind of the Laudanum user began to show the same signs of collapse. At first, the changes were subtle. A moment of confusion here, a misplaced object there. Families explained it away as a distraction or fatigue. But soon the confusion grew more severe. Addicts lost their sense of direction. They walked into rooms and forgot why they had entered. They wandered through fields and could not remember the path home. Familiar places became strange. The world around them no longer held the same order it once did. It was as if the threads of their memory had begun to unravel. Hallucinations followed. Users began to see things that were not there. Some described lights flickering in corners. Others reacted to figures that no one else could see. They reached for objects that did not exist or recoiled from shadows that had no form. Families were unsettled by these moments but tried to remain patient. They believed the mind was sick, perhaps cursed, perhaps touched by unseen forces. It is almost sarcastic to think that a medicine sold so casually at markets could leave people screaming at visions in their own homes. The instability of emotion was another clear sign. Addicts could not control their feelings. In one moment, they laughed. In the next, they wept. They shifted from calm to rage without warning. These episodes frightened their families, who did not understand the cause. Children avoided their parents, unsure whether they would be embraced or struck. Spouses walked carefully, speaking softly, hoping not to trigger another outburst. Neighbours whispered about strange behaviour, about madness, about spirits. The addict became unpredictable, and unpredictability was seen as a danger. The community interpreted these behaviours through the lens of belief rather than medicine. In a world where superstition was strong, hallucinations and erratic emotions were often blamed on possession. A man who shouted at empty corners of his home was said to be haunted. A woman who laughed and cried at the same time was believed to be touched by spirits. Families feared shame and gossip. They often hid their loved ones away, keeping them inside when visitors came. What they thought was protection was actually isolation. The addict sank deeper into loneliness, cut off from those who might have helped. The loss of mental clarity extended beyond hallucinations and emotion. Daily life became difficult. Addicts forgot basic tasks, leaving fires burning or doors unlatched. They misplaced belongings, sometimes losing entire days of memory. Work became impossible. Conversations fell apart mid-sentence. The sense of self grew weaker with each passing week. Families struggled to care for them, torn between pity and fear. Some remained patient, while others grew resentful. In both cases, the addict's decline continued without pause. This decline was not seen as connected to laudanum. People still believed in the medicine. They thought it was easing pain, calming nerves, and providing sleep. They did not see that it was also destroying the mind. The word addiction did not exist, so there was no way to frame what was happening. Instead, the explanation returned to fate, weakness, or punishment. Compared to modern times, when mental illness and addiction are studied with precision, the medieval world looks like a place where people lived in the dark, guided more by fear than by understanding. The hallucinations grew more intense with continued use. Some addicts began to mutter constantly, speaking to figures no one else could see. Others screamed in the night, convinced that shapes surrounded them. Families grew frightened. Neighbours became suspicious. Rumours spread quickly. People were said to be cursed, bewitched, or possessed. These whispers shaped how addicts were treated. They were no longer seen as sick, but as dangerous. Fear replaced sympathy. The gap between the addict and the community widened. The emotional instability did not spare anyone in the household. Children bore the brunt of it. They were shouted at without cause or ignored completely. Spouses felt the weight of living with someone whose mood shifted without reason. Entire households revolved around avoiding conflict, predicting outbursts, and trying to maintain calm. The stress-drained families who already struggled to survive in a harsh world. Addicts did not mean to harm those around them, but their loss of control spread suffering far beyond themselves. I cannot help but feel that the greatest tragedy was not only the collapse of one life, but the slow unravelling of entire families tied to that life. Some addicts wandered into the streets during fits of confusion or hallucination. Villagers who saw them recoiled. They whispered about evil spirits and divine punishment. Children were warned to keep away. In some cases, the afflicted were taken to priests or monks for rituals. These rituals did nothing, but they reinforced the belief that the cause was spiritual. This misunderstanding left the addict untreated and unsupported. Instead of help, they received fear, isolation, or even cruelty. The cycle of decline deepened. The slow collapse of the mind was harder for families to endure than the collapse of the body. A weak body could still be cared for, fed, and carried. A broken mind was unpredictable, frightening, and exhausting. Families often reached their limits. Some abandoned their loved ones, leaving them to wander. Others locked them away, hoping to avoid scandal. What began as a common remedy had transformed into a source of shame and secrecy. The silence around laudanum grew thicker, making it harder for anyone to break free. By this stage, addicts were no longer trusted within their communities. They were suspected of bringing curses, spreading disorder, or harbouring spirits. What they truly suffered from was dependence on a medicine that eroded the mind. But in a world without that knowledge, they carried the weight of misunderstanding. Their decline was met with fear rather than compassion, with superstition rather than support. As the mind slipped further from control, society itself began to turn away. The addict became less of a person and more of a symbol of weakness or punishment. That was the path from trust to fear, from treatment to suspicion, from acceptance to rejection. And it was this fear that opened the way to the next stage, when society no longer saw addicts as sick at all, but instead as people cursed by weakness, with no understanding of what addiction truly meant. In the medieval world, the word addiction did not exist. There was no language to describe a person whose life had been consumed by laudanum. People saw the decline but gave it different names. They called it weakness, fragility, or poor character. A man who could not rise without his bottle was said to have a weak spirit. A woman who cried and laughed without reason was thought to be too delicate to handle the burdens of life. No one connected these patterns to the constant use of the medicine. To them, the sickness was inside the person, not inside the bottle. Superstition shaped these beliefs. Many thought that the strange behaviours of addicts were punishments from God. If someone wandered aimlessly, saw visions, or lost control of their emotions, it was said to be divine judgment. Families prayed for forgiveness, believing that sins had brought suffering into their homes. Priests warned that the afflicted were being tested by heaven. Neighbours whispered that curses had been laid upon them. In such an atmosphere, laudanum was rarely blamed. Instead, the addict was seen as guilty of weakness or as a vessel for punishment. It is almost sarcastic to note that a bottle sold as medicine was excused, while the sick person was condemned as if they had chosen their suffering. This misunderstanding meant that real help was never offered. Instead of treating the condition as an illness, people turned to rituals and superstitions. Families sought priests, monks, and holy men to intervene. Addicts were taken to churches or monasteries, where prayers were read aloud and rituals performed. Some were sprinkled with holy water, Others were made to fast, and some were locked in rooms for days to drive out imagined spirits. These acts did not heal them. They only added fear and shame to lives already burdened by dependence. The belief that addicts were weak spirits spread quickly. Villages were close-knit, and news travelled fast. Once a person was seen as fragile or cursed, their reputation was marked. Children whispered about them. Neighbours avoided them. Some were not invited to gatherings or meals. Entire families suffered because of the label. They carried the weight of suspicion along with the burden of caring for someone who could not recover. Life grew heavier, but no one dared to question the cause. To challenge the common view was to risk being accused of the same weakness. The absence of a word for addiction meant the absence of recognition. Without recognition, there could be no solutions. People accepted decline as fate, not as something that could be prevented or treated. They watched loved ones waste away without understanding. To them, it was simply life, harsh and unavoidable. This ignorance was not willful. It was born of limited knowledge, of a world where science was scarce and superstition was abundant. Yet the result was the same. Addicts were trapped in silence, surrounded by misunderstanding, with no path to recovery. The role of the church was powerful in this stage. Priests often declared that strange behaviour was evidence of sin. They guided families toward confession and penance. Addicts were made to kneel in prayer, sometimes for hours. They were told to repent, as if repentance could erase dependence. When their behaviour did not change, it was said that the devil was strong within them. Some were taken into monasteries, isolated from their communities, left to struggle in silence. Compared to modern times, where treatment centres and support systems exist, the medieval reliance on prayer alone feels like trying to cure a broken bone by wishing it whole. Monasteries became holding places for many addicts. Families who could not manage the burden sent them away, hoping the church would find answers. Monks, however, had no tools beyond ritual. They read scriptures, sang hymns, and sometimes used physical punishment to force obedience. Addicts grew weaker in these conditions, not stronger. Their bodies craved laudanum, their minds unravelled. But the church did not recognize this. What they saw was stubbornness, possession, or resistance to divine will. The true illness remained hidden behind layers of superstition. The wider community treated these individuals with fear. They avoided their homes, kept children away, and spread stories of curses and hauntings. Families were marked by association. A household with an addict inside was spoken of as if it were touched by darkness. This isolation made survival harder. Support vanished when it was most needed. What should have been compassion turned into rejection. Addicts, already trapped by their dependence, now faced the added burden of being cast out by the very people who might have helped them. What strikes me most is how complete the misunderstanding was. I cannot help but reflect on how people choose explanations that fit their beliefs rather than the evidence before them. They saw bottles emptied day after day, yet they blamed spirits and curses. They watched bodies waste away, yet they insisted it was punishment. They witnessed confusion and hallucination, yet they sent their loved ones to monasteries instead of questioning the medicine. This blindness did not come from cruelty alone. It came from a world that had no other framework to understand what was happening. In this climate, laudanum continued to spread. No stigma was attached to the bottle itself. People still bought it, still drank it, still trusted it. The addict was shamed, but the substance was not. That separation allowed the cycle to continue without interruption. Villages lost members, families lost stability, but markets kept selling. Laudanum remained both a cure and a curse, hidden in plain sight. As superstition deepened, the place of addicts in society became more fragile. They were not only sick in body and mind, they were marked as outcasts, as warnings to others. This shift from misunderstanding to fear marked the next stage of their lives. The step from being misunderstood to being rejected was small, and it was the one that many addicts soon faced as they found themselves shunned by the community that once embraced them. Life for the laudanum addict did not only unravel inside the body and the mind, it also unraveled in the space between them and their community. At first, neighbours tried to ignore the changes. They told themselves it was simply weakness or illness. But over time, the behaviour of addicts became harder to deny. Their pale faces, their trembling hands, their sudden outbursts, and their strange hallucinations began to unsettle those around them. People who once shared meals, conversations, and prayers with them started to keep their distance. What began as whispers soon became avoidance. Festivals and gatherings were often the first places where rejection showed itself. Villages relied on celebrations to maintain unity. Feasts marked the passing of seasons. Weddings brought families together. Religious holidays reminded them of shared faith. Yet the laudanum addict was gradually excluded from these moments. Invitations stopped arriving. When gatherings were held, they were left unmentioned or unwelcome. Their presence was seen as a disruption, something that might bring shame or unease. It is almost sarcastic that a person who once shared joy with neighbours could be cast aside simply because they swallowed from the wrong bottle. The stories spread quickly. Rumours that addicts were cursed or haunted grew louder. Some said they carried evil spirits. Others said they had been punished by God. The strange behaviours caused by laudanum were explained through superstition rather than medicine. People who cried and laughed in the same hour were described as possessed. People who shouted at shadows were said to see demons. These rumours carried weight in a world ruled by fear and faith. Neighbours began to step away, not only from the addict but from their entire family. Children were warned not to play near their homes. Women whispered as they passed in the markets. Men spoke quietly in taverns, trading tales of curses and hauntings. The isolation was not limited to festivals. Everyday life changed as well. Families of addicts noticed that visitors grew fewer. People stopped knocking at their doors. Offers of help disappeared. Instead, there was silence and distance. Some families tried to hide the addict away to avoid shame. They kept them indoors, away from windows, away from eyes. But even in hiding, the truth was known. Rumours always found a way to escape. Once the label of curse or possession was attached, it could not be erased. Children of addicts carried the burden as well. They were told not to approach neighbours, not to attend certain gatherings, and not to play with other children. Parents in the community feared contamination, not from disease but from superstition. They thought the curse might spread. They told their children to stay away, to avoid the family touched by laudanum. This isolation shaped the lives of young ones who had done nothing wrong. They grew up under the shadow of rejection, marked by the choices of their parents. The community's rejection was not deliberate cruelty in their own eyes. They believed they were protecting themselves. In a world where knowledge of medicine was scarce, fear was often stronger than compassion. To distance oneself from the addict was seen as a form of safety. The more unusual the behaviour became, the greater the distance grew. Families who needed help most were abandoned when they needed it most. This pattern repeated itself in villages across the land, leaving addicts and their loved ones alone. The separation became permanent for many. Some addicts were never seen again at public events. Their names faded from community lists, their presence forgotten. Families were left to shoulder the burden in silence. Without the support of neighbours, survival grew harder. Food, labour, and companionship were shared less freely. What had once been a network of interdependence was broken. The addict's family became an island, surrounded not by water, but by suspicion. Compared to modern times, when addiction is recognised and support groups exist, the medieval response of silence and exclusion feels like building walls around those who are drowning instead of reaching out a hand. This exclusion did more than remove social comfort. It deepened the suffering of addicts themselves. They felt the stares, the whispers, the absence of friends. The medicine that had already taken over their bodies now took away their community. They became outsiders, tolerated only at a distance, spoken of only in hushed voices. Even if they wanted to return, there was no way back. The mark of superstition was too strong. The label of possession was too heavy. They were no longer members of the community. They were reminders of fear. What strikes me most is the cruelty hidden inside ordinary actions. I cannot help but reflect on how neighbours who once shared bread and stories turned into strangers overnight, leaving the addict to wither without comfort. The speed of the change is what lingers. One day, a person was trusted. The next, they were avoided. It shows how fragile belonging could be when superstition ruled over understanding. The pattern repeated again and again. The addict's home grew silent, their family withdrew, and their place in society dissolved. They walked alone through streets they once called familiar. Children pointed, adults whispered, and doors remained closed. The bottle had already made them dependent. Now the community has made them invisible. This dual weight of physical craving and social rejection left them with nothing but the medicine itself. They clung to it not only for calm, but because it was the only thing that did not turn away from them. As time passed, the divide between addict and community widened into something permanent. They were no longer seen as neighbours or family members. They were seen as threats, as curses, as examples of what to avoid. In this way, laudanum users lost not only their health and sanity, but also their place in the fabric of village life. They became shadows at the edge of gatherings, figures whispered about but never welcomed. Their lives turned inward, hidden behind walls, defined only by the next dose. And yet, even within this rejection, some tried to hide their pain, especially women who feared shame more than sickness. They dressed carefully, painted their faces, and spoke as if nothing was wrong. They tried to mask the truth even as their bodies weakened and their spirits collapsed. Among those who suffered under laudanum, women often carried their burden in silence. They were expected to keep their homes in order, to maintain appearances, and to act as the quiet centre of family life. Because of these expectations, many tried to hide what the medicine was doing to them. Outwardly, they still dressed neatly. They combed their hair, put on jewellery, and wore their finest clothes when they had the chance. From a distance, they looked as though nothing was wrong. But anyone who looked closely saw the truth. Their eyes carried a heavy weariness that no amount of clothing or cosmetics could hide. They often explained away their condition with simple words. When neighbours asked how they were, they would smile faintly and say they only had a small headache, nothing more. When their hands trembled, they said they were just tired. When they looked pale, they blamed the weather or a sleepless night. It was easier to offer excuses than to admit the truth. To confess dependence on laudanum would have been to invite judgment and gossip. By insisting that nothing serious was happening, they tried to protect themselves from the whispers of the village. It is almost sarcastic that while their bodies were wasting away, they insisted it was only a minor complaint, as if a headache could explain everything. Even in their weakness, many women continued with their duties. They prepared meals, swept floors, and cared for children. They moved slowly, often pausing to steady themselves, but they carried on. A small bottle might be hidden in their pocket or kept near their bedside. Between chores, they would sip just enough to calm their nerves or to push away the trembling. Then they would return to their work, as if nothing had happened. Families sometimes noticed but chose not to press the issue. The appearance of normalcy was often enough to maintain silence. As long as the home functioned, the truth remained unspoken. The pressure to appear normal came from society as much as from within. Women were judged not only for their health, but also for their ability to keep a household steady. A woman who fell into visible weakness risked shame for her entire family. She risked being called cursed, fragile, or unfit. To avoid this, she dressed carefully, painted her cheeks, and smiled when spoken to. The effort to appear well became as heavy as the illness itself. She carried two burdens at once, the weight of her dependence and the weight of her disguise. This double life grew exhausting. By day, she tried to act as though she was still part of the community, still capable, still strong. By night, she consumed more laudanum, often alone, sinking into the silence that the drug provided. The contrast between appearance and reality widened. The more she tried to look normal, the more she relied on the drug to maintain the mask. Each dose brought her another hour of composure, another morning of calm, another evening without questions. But the cost grew higher each time, compared to modern times, where counseling and support groups allow people to speak openly. The silence of the medieval woman feels like a prison built out of fear of shame. Families often played along with the disguise. Husbands told neighbours that their wives were only tired. Children were instructed not to speak of the bottles they saw. Even parents and siblings looked away, convincing themselves that nothing serious was wrong. This silence was not born of ignorance alone. It was also born of fear. To admit the truth was to invite gossip, and gossip was powerful enough to ruin entire families. Protecting reputation became more important than protecting health. In this way, dependence continued unchecked, hidden behind polite smiles and quiet excuses. Some women became skilled at deception. They knew how to hide their bottles in folds of clothing or beneath furniture. They timed their doses carefully, making sure to drink when no one was looking. They kept their movements steady in public, even if their hands trembled in private. They learned how to laugh at the right moments and how to speak just enough to avoid suspicion. These skills did not erase their suffering, but they allowed them to continue their double life. They became actresses in their own homes and villages, performing normalcy while collapsing inside. But even the strongest disguise could not erase the signs entirely. Neighbours began to notice that some women avoided eye contact. They noticed the slow steps, the faint voices, the occasional slips in behaviour. Rumours spread quietly. Some believed these women were hiding sickness. Others believed they were cursed. Few suspected laudanum directly, because it was still seen as medicine. And so, the women remained trapped, blamed for their fragility but never recognised for their suffering. The drug that controlled them also allowed them to hide in plain sight. The exhaustion of living two lives took its toll. Women grew weaker, not only in body but also in spirit. They carried the constant fear of being discovered. Every day was spent balancing between secrecy and survival. The energy required for the act left them drained. They smiled less, spoke less, and withdrew more. Yet they clung to their routine because it was all they had. Admitting the truth would have meant exposure and rejection. And so they continued, pretending even as they wasted away. What stands out to me is the loneliness of their struggle. I cannot help but reflect on how these women carried their despair in silence, surrounded by family and neighbours who never truly saw them. They lived in the middle of communities yet remained invisible. Their attempts to appear normal only deepened their isolation. The very effort to avoid shame made their suffering greater. Over time, their disguises wore thin. No amount of careful dress or painted cheeks could cover the hollowness of their eyes. No polite excuse could hide the tremors in their hands. The truth eventually showed itself, but by then it was too late. Dependence had already hollowed them out. Their efforts to appear normal had only delayed recognition, never prevented it. And in delaying, they had allowed the cycle to root itself deeper. These women became symbols of hidden despair, walking reminders that laudanum's grip did not always show itself openly. They tried to carry on, tried to maintain dignity, but the cost was unbearable. The community saw fragments of the truth but chose silence. Families noticed signs but avoided confrontation, and the women themselves carried the heaviest burden, caught between the need for relief and the fear of being shunned. Their silence did not end when night came. It followed them into sleep, or rather into the absence of true sleep. Laudanum promised rest, but what it delivered was another kind of torment, one that would soon reveal itself in restless nights and haunted dreams. Sleep, once the only place where people could escape their troubles, became another battlefield for those bound to laudanum. The drug was trusted to bring rest, to silence the racing thoughts and calm the restless body. At first, it seemed to work. Many fell asleep faster after taking their dose, but the sleep it gave was not the deep, healing kind. It was shallow, broken, and filled with strange disturbances. Instead of quiet nights, families began to hear unsettling sounds from rooms where addicts slept. The calm they hoped for was replaced with new kinds of fear. Some addicts walked in their sleep. They rose in the middle of the night, stumbling through dark hallways, eyes open but unseeing. Families followed quietly, trying to guide them back without waking them. These episodes were frightening, not only because of the danger, but because they revealed how fragile the mind had become. Others shouted or cried out, their voices echoing through the house. In villages where homes were close together, neighbours sometimes heard as well. Whispers spread, and rumours grew stronger. People began to say that evil spirits roamed in the night. It is almost sarcastic that a medicine sold as a cure for sleeplessness often turned homes into places of shouting, wandering, and chaos after dark. Dreams became tangled with reality. Addicts often described visions so vivid that they could not separate them from waking life. Some woke convinced that arguments or disasters had truly happened. Others moved through their days carrying pieces of dreams that clung to them like heavy shadows. The line between real and unreal blurred until they no longer trusted their senses. Families found themselves constantly explaining what was true and what was imagined, but the addict remained uncertain. This confusion deepened their dependence on the drug, since they believed more doses would quiet the disturbances. Instead, the cycle only grew worse. The mornings after these nights were harsh. Addicts woke with headaches that felt crushing. Their bodies ached as though they had never rested. They dragged themselves through the day with less energy than before, seeking relief in yet another dose. The promise of rest was broken. Instead of restoring them, the nights drained them further. Families grew tired as well, forced to endure sleepless nights filled with noise, wandering, and fear of harm. Children cried when their parents shouted in the dark. Spouses grew weary of constant disruptions. Whole households suffered for the sake of one person's dependence. The loss of restful sleep carried heavy consequences. Without proper rest, the body weakens faster. The immune system failed, leaving addicts vulnerable to every illness that spread through their communities. Minds already fragile slipped further toward confusion and instability. Work suffered as fatigue made concentration impossible. Even the simplest chores became overwhelming. Sleep, which should have been the one refuge left, no longer offered any relief. Instead, it became another form of torment, one that could not be escaped. Families tried to cope in various ways. Some tied bells to doors so they would hear when their loved ones wandered. Others stayed awake through parts of the night, watching, waiting, ready to intervene. These efforts brought little comfort. The problem remained, night after night, with no solution. Neighbours grew suspicious as the noise carried across thin walls or open windows. They whispered about curses and hauntings, convinced that what they heard could not be explained by ordinary sickness. The addict's suffering was once again interpreted through superstition rather than medicine. The exhaustion of broken nights spread beyond the addict. Entire households became weaker, more irritable, and more isolated. Families who had once welcomed visitors now shut their doors, ashamed of the sounds that echoed after dark. They withdrew from social life, adding to the isolation already caused by gossip. Sleep should have been the time to gather strength for the next day. Instead, it became a source of dread. Compared to modern times when doctors study sleep disorders and offer real treatment, the medieval home filled with midnight cries shows how helpless people were when medicine became poison. The addicts themselves rarely admitted the full extent of the problem. They told others they slept poorly, but they did not describe the wandering or the shouting. Some convinced themselves that it was nothing unusual. Others claimed not to remember the nights at all. Families, too, kept quiet. They feared the judgment of neighbours. To admit that their loved ones screamed or roamed in the night was to invite more suspicion and gossip. Silence once again surrounded the truth, leaving everyone trapped in the same endless pattern. The slow erosion of sleep also eroded trust inside families. Spouses began to resent the endless nights of disturbance. Children grew frightened of their parents. Tension filled the household, adding to the burden already caused by dependence. What little unity remained was weakened. The drug that had promised calm now robbed them of peace in every sense, both day and night. The absence of rest was not just physical, it was emotional and spiritual as well. Homes lost their comfort, and nights lost their safety. What stands out most to me is the quiet despair that must have settled into these homes. I cannot help but reflect on how nights that should have been filled with silence and rest turned into scenes of confusion, fear, and exhaustion. The people who suffered most were not only the addicts, but also those who loved them, forced to endure the collapse of both day and night. This despair was not loud, not dramatic. It was steady and constant, like a slow drip that wore away everything it touched. In time, the loss of sleep weakened addicts beyond repair. Their bodies, already thin and pale, grew more fragile. Their minds, already unstable, slipped further away from reason. Each night without rest added to the toll. The promise of healing turned into another form of punishment. Families watched, helpless, as their loved ones wasted away before their eyes. They prayed for rest, but rest never came. The bottle that had once been trusted as medicine had stolen even the simple gift of sleep. And as their nights grew darker and their mornings more painful, another decline began to take shape. The body, already frail, started to suffer deeper wounds. The inner organs, unseen but vital, began to fail, adding yet another layer to the slow destruction. The suffering of the laudanum addict did not stop with restless nights or troubled minds. It also began to eat away at the organs that could not be seen. The stomach, which once handled the heavy bread and stews of medieval life, grew weaker. Meals no longer brought comfort. Instead, they brought pain. Addicts spoke of constant cramps and aching bellies. Some avoided food altogether because every bite led to discomfort. Families tried to feed them, offering broths, grains, or milk, but nothing seemed to settle. The body no longer welcomed nourishment. It had become a battlefield where food itself caused harm. Constipation was one of the most common troubles. Days passed without relief, leaving the addict in agony. Their bellies swelled painfully, and they shifted restlessly, unable to find comfort. Others experienced the opposite, suffering from long bouts of diarrhea that left them drained and dehydrated. Both conditions weakened the body further, stripping it of what little strength remained. In a world with little understanding of digestion, families tried herbs, teas, and prayers, but nothing solved the problem. The drug that was supposed to soothe had instead broken the very system that sustained life. It is almost sarcastic that laudanum, trusted as a cure for pain, left its users crying out in pain after every meal. The damage did not stop with the stomach and intestines. Over time, the liver and kidneys also began to fail. These organs, unseen and unknown to medieval understanding, bore the weight of constant exposure to the drug. The liver weakened, struggling to process what was poured into the body. The kidneys faltered, unable to filter waste as they once had. The signs were visible in the swelling of the limbs, the yellowing of skin, and the constant fatigue. Yet no one connected these signs to laudanum. People said it was age, a curse, or a punishment. They did not see that the bottle was slowly shutting down the body from the inside. Families grew desperate to help, but their remedies failed. They brought herbs for the stomach, tonics for the bowels, and endless prayers for relief. Some turned to fasting, believing that the body would heal if given rest. Others tried to increase feeding, hoping more nourishment would strengthen the weak. Nothing worked. The addicts themselves often pleaded for more laudanum, convinced that only the medicine could quiet the pain. And in truth, it sometimes did, but only for a short time. Then the cycle repeated. More laudanum brought brief calm, followed by deeper damage. The spiral continued, unseen and unstoppable. The toll of digestive collapse spread beyond the addict. Families were forced to endure the endless suffering. Nights were filled with groans, days with exhaustion. The home became centered on pain. Meals, once the heart of family life, turned into dreaded moments. Everyone watched as their loved one struggled to eat, then suffered afterward. The joy of sharing food disappeared. Fear replaced it. The table became a place of sorrow rather than fellowship. Families felt powerless, unable to explain or repair what was happening. The addicts grew thinner with each passing week. They wasted away before the eyes of those who loved them. Bones jutted out sharply, skin sagged, and eyes grew hollow. The once strong workers, mothers, and fathers became shadows of themselves. The body was no longer nourished. It was consumed by its own decline. Compared to modern times, when medical tests can reveal failing organs early, the medieval addict wasted away without answers, with only silence filling the space where knowledge should have been. Villagers responded with the same superstition that coloured every stage of addiction. They said the sickness was a punishment. They said the family was cursed. They whispered about hidden sins or unseen forces. Some claimed that the constant stomach troubles were a sign of demons feeding inside the body. None recognized the truth, because the truth was beyond their reach. The science that could have explained it did not exist, and so, the addict's suffering was twisted into stories that made them outcast once again. The addicts themselves rarely understood what was happening. They only knew that they hurt constantly. The stomach twisted, the bowels rebelled, the body grew weaker. In their confusion, they clung to the only thing they thought might help more laudanum. It became their only answer, even though it was also the cause. They begged for it, hid it, and guarded it as though it were life itself. Families gave it reluctantly, torn between hope and despair. They could not deny the pleas of their loved ones, even as they watched it destroy them further. The slow destruction of the organs was invisible but relentless. Unlike pale skin or trembling hands, it could not be hidden behind clothes or smiles. It revealed itself only through pain and decline, and by then it was too late. No prayer, no herb, no ritual could restore what had been lost. Families carried their loved ones through this stage with heavy hearts, knowing that death was creeping closer with every passing day. The body that once carried life with strength was collapsing from within, leaving only weakness behind. What strikes me most is how silent this suffering must have been. I cannot help but reflect on how addicts endured endless pain in their bellies while their families prayed helplessly, unable to name or fight the real cause. The silence was crushing, not only because of the ignorance but also because of the isolation it created. Pain became a private world that no one else could enter, no one else could understand. That loneliness may have been as heavy as the physical suffering itself. The decline of the stomach, the liver, and the kidneys marked another step in the long collapse. Addicts could no longer hide behind painted cheeks or forced smiles. Their weakness was too obvious, their suffering too constant. The community whispered louder, families prayed harder, but nothing changed. The drug had already done its damage. The body was failing, and with it, the last traces of strength disappeared, and as their organs weakened and their pain deepened, another change began to shape how they were seen. Their behaviours, already strange from sleepless nights and broken minds, became more disturbing. The very way they acted frightened those around them, setting the stage for even greater suspicion and fear. The strangeness of laudanum addiction did not stop at restless nights or weakened bodies. As the drug took further hold, behavior itself began to change in ways that unsettled everyone around. People no longer acted like themselves. Their gestures, their voices, and their movements began to follow patterns that made others uneasy. Families watched with worry at first, then with fear. Neighbors who once dismissed their troubles as weakness began to whisper that something far darker was happening. The addict no longer seemed like a member of the community, but like someone touched by something unknown. One of the most common sights was laughter without cause. Addicts sometimes sat for long stretches in silence and then suddenly burst into laughter. They could remain in the corner of a kitchen or at the edge of a room, smiling and chuckling at nothing for hours. Family members tried to ask what amused them, but there was no answer. The laughter continued until it turned into muttering or fell away into exhaustion. The emptiness of these moments unsettled those who witnessed them. It was not joy, not humour, but something hollow that frightened more than it reassured. It is almost sarcastic that a medicine once praised for calming nerves left people giggling alone in corners like fools, scaring the very families who had trusted it. Other times, the behaviour was more violent. Addicts screamed without warning, their voices sharp and piercing, echoing through the home or across the village. Nothing had touched them. No one had spoken, yet they cried out as though struck. Children hid under blankets when these outbursts came. Spouses flinched, neighbours whispered, and the sound travelled quickly. These sudden screams became another reason for communities to turn away. They explained them not through sickness, but through superstition, convinced that spirits or demons had seized control. The addict became a living example of possession in the eyes of many. Some turned their strange behaviour inward. They clawed at their skin, scratching until it bled, insisting that something inside needed to be freed. They picked at scabs and tore at flesh, leaving marks that horrified their families. Attempts to stop them often failed. Addicts resisted, convinced that release would come only through pain. The sight of blood and wounds deepened the fear surrounding them. Families began to wonder if they were cursed. Neighbours began to believe that they carried evil. In truth, the drug had disturbed the mind so completely that pain felt like the only answer left. These behaviours, seen together, created an image of madness. The addict no longer seemed like a person suffering from a substance, but like someone transformed into something unrecognizable. The laughter, the screams, and the self-inflicted wounds all reinforced the view that they were dangerous. Fear spread quickly, and once fear took hold, it replaced compassion. Families who once prayed for healing began to guard themselves. Neighbours who once offered help locked their doors. The addict was left alone with their strangeness, marked as something other than human. The church played a role here as well. Priests and monks, already accustomed to explaining suffering as sin or punishment, saw these behaviours as further proof of possession. They ordered prayers, exorcisms, and rituals. Some believed that the screams were demons leaving the body. Others thought the laughter was mockery from dark forces. Nothing changed after these ceremonies, but the belief grew stronger. The addict was treated less like a patient and more like a vessel of evil. Families were told to endure, to repent, or to separate themselves. The truth of Laudanum's role remained hidden behind layers of faith and fear. The community's response deepened the addict's isolation. People avoided them in markets, stepped away from them on roads, and warned children to keep their distance. Invitations disappeared, conversations fell silent, and doors closed more quickly. The addict became the subject of whispers and warnings. Stories spread about their behaviour, each tale adding new details until the truth was buried. The strangeness became legend, reinforcing fear with every retelling. Compared to modern times, when mental illness and addiction are recognised as conditions to be treated, the medieval tendency to label sufferers as cursed shows how far fear can go when understanding is absent. Families suffered alongside their loved ones. They were embarrassed by the strange behaviour, frightened by the outbursts, and overwhelmed by the wounds. They tried to keep the addict hidden, but could not stop the rumours. The home became a prison, filled with silence and fear. Children grew up watching their parents laugh at nothing, scream in the night, or tear at their skin. These memories shaped them as much as hunger or illness did. The weight of addiction was never carried by one person alone. It spread through entire households, breaking them piece by piece. What strikes me most about this stage is the helplessness. I cannot help but reflect on how families watch their loved ones slip into strangeness, unable to explain it, unable to stop it, forced to live inside the fear it created. The silence of the medieval world offered no answers, and the superstition offered only more burden. The addict's suffering became everyone's suffering, and no one could escape it. As the behaviours grew more severe, the addict's dependence grew more obvious. They could not live without the drug, but the drug was also destroying them. Their bodies craved it, their minds collapsed under it, and their behaviours exposed the chaos it created. Families struggled to maintain dignity, communities spread fear, and the church reinforced superstition. The addict was trapped at the centre, crushed by forces they could not control. The fear of their behaviour only worsened when the drug ran out. Withdrawal brought new horrors, new suffering, and new desperation. The strangeness of their actions in everyday life was nothing compared to the torment that followed when no laudanum could be found. When laudanum was not available, the addict's suffering became unbearable. The body, long accustomed to its presence, turned against itself the moment the drug was withheld. Trembling began almost immediately. Hands shook, legs quivered, and the entire body seemed unable to stay still. Sweat poured from their skin even in the coldest months. They shivered and burned at the same time, restless and unsettled. Their hearts raced in their chests, beating so quickly that families feared sudden death. Every muscle ached, every breath felt heavy. The person who only hours before seemed calm now appeared consumed by torment. Food became impossible to take. Even small bites of bread turned their stomachs. Water itself sometimes caused nausea. Addicts refused meals, pushed away plates, and groaned at the thought of eating. Sleep was no kinder. Their eyes closed, but rest never came. They tossed endlessly, thrashing on straw mattresses, moaning in frustration. Families stayed awake through these nights, powerless to bring comfort. Each hour stretched endlessly, marked by groans, whispers, and pleas for relief. Without laudanum, life felt unbearable for the addict, and their suffering dragged everyone else into the same dark pit. The mind grew just as desperate as the body. Thoughts circled around the drug, refusing to let go. Addicts begged, pleaded, and bargained for another drop. They promised to change, promised to work harder, promised anything if only they could have it. Some wept openly, clutching the hands of their families, begging for relief. Others grew angry, shouting and threatening. The craving consumed them until no other thought remained. They did not care about dignity or pride. They cared only about the next dose. It is almost sarcastic that a medicine sold for comfort turned its absence into a punishment harsher than any illness it was meant to cure. When families resisted, the addict often turned to other means. Small thefts began to appear. Coins vanished from cupboards, tools disappeared from barns, and jewellery went missing from drawers. Some addicts sold possessions openly, exchanging valuable household items for small bottles of laudanum. Families grew poorer as more people left their homes. Neighbours noticed the pattern but often stayed silent, either out of pity or fear. Others whispered about the shame of it, spreading stories that deepened the family's isolation. Each missing item was another step in the collapse of both household and reputation. In some cases, desperation turned violent. Addicts shouted at their loved ones, accused them of hiding the drug, and sometimes struck out in anger. Families feared these moments most. The gentle father or mother who once cared for children became a stranger, consumed by rage. The trust that once bound families together was broken by desperation. Children learned to hide when the cravings grew strong. Spouses struggled to balance compassion with fear. The home, already burdened by secrecy and shame, became a place of tension and danger. The wider community watched from a distance. They saw the changes, the thefts, and the anger, and they whispered among themselves. Rumors of curses grew stronger. Some claimed that addicts were possessed, pointing to their desperate actions as proof. Others said the family had sinned, and this was the punishment. Very few suspected that it was the absence of laudanum itself causing the torment. Knowledge of withdrawal did not exist. The suffering was seen as weakness, not as the natural result of dependence. This ignorance deepened the shame and left families with no one to turn to. The cycle of relief and torment continued endlessly. When laudanum was available, the addict found temporary calm. When it ran out, the body collapsed into chaos. Families tried to keep a steady supply, but poverty and scarcity often made this impossible. Each time the drug disappeared, the same suffering returned. The pattern was predictable, yet no one could stop it. Families lived in constant fear of the next shortage, knowing what horrors it would bring. Addicts lived in constant dread of the next empty bottle, knowing that their peace was only temporary. Compared to modern times, when withdrawal is recognized as part of addiction and treatments exist to ease the suffering, the medieval addict endured the full weight of it without explanation, support, or relief. There were no doctors to guide them through it, no safe spaces to recover, no knowledge that the torment would eventually lessen. Every withdrawal felt like death, and many believed it truly was. Families prayed desperately, thinking the end had come, only to see their loved ones survive long enough to repeat the cycle again. The desperation reached such levels that some addicts were willing to do anything for relief. They begged strangers in markets, traded labor for even the smallest drop, or traveled long distances in search of sellers. Some degraded themselves, offering whatever they could in exchange. Pride and reputation no longer mattered. The craving erased all barriers. Those who once held positions of respect now knelt before merchants, pleading like beggars. The humiliation was heavy, but the craving was heavier. Nothing else carried weight compared to the need for laudanum. Families bore the shame of these actions as much as the addict. Neighbors judged them, whispered about them, and sometimes turned against them. Poverty grew as possessions were sold, labor was abandoned, and thefts increased. Children carried the scars of watching their parents reduced to pleading or stealing. Spouses carried the weight of both care and shame. The entire household bent beneath the burden of one person's dependence. Yet the addict did not see this. In their torment, nothing existed beyond the next drop of medicine. What stands out most to me about this stage is the loss of humanity. I cannot help but reflect on how the craving reduced people to shadows of themselves, willing to give away everything they owned and everything they loved for one more dose. The drug stripped them not only of health and stability, but of dignity itself. Families who had once lived with respect and pride were dragged into the same pit, all because of a bottle they had once trusted as healing. The cruelty of it lay not only in the suffering, but in the way it erased the very core of who they were. The torments of withdrawal showed everyone that laudanum was no simple medicine. But instead of bringing understanding, these horrors pushed people further towards superstition. Priests and monks claimed the suffering was the work of the devil. Families dragged their loved ones to churches and monasteries, begging for spiritual relief. But prayer and ritual could not end the cycle. And so the addict's desperation was handed from household to church, still without answers, still without relief. When families could no longer endure the torment of laudanum withdrawal, they often turned to the church. The church and the monastery were seen as the last places of hope, the only institutions with authority over both body and soul. People believed that prayer could heal anything. They believed that confession could cleanse not just sin but also sickness. So they brought their loved ones to priests and monks, carrying them into stone halls lit by candles, convinced that divine power would do what medicine could not. But for laudanum addicts, these places offered little more than disappointment. The first approach was always prayer. Families knelt together, speaking words of desperation, begging for relief. The addict, trembling and sweating, was placed before the altar. Priests recited holy texts, asking for deliverance from whatever spirit or curse they believed was present. Sometimes the addict quieted briefly, either from exhaustion or from the calm of the ritual. Families clung to these moments, hoping they signaled healing, but the peace never lasted. The cravings returned, the tremors continued, and the pleas for more laudanum began again. Prayer did not end the dependence. It only added another layer of false hope. It is almost sarcastic that priests declared victory after a few moments of quiet, when the addict simply collapsed from exhaustion, rather than found relief from God. Confession was another method. Addicts were urged to admit sins, to speak of hidden guilt, to lay bare their souls before God. Priests believed that the strange behaviors and torment were punishments for moral failings. They pressed the addict to confess to anything that might explain the suffering. Addicts, confused and desperate, often said whatever they thought the priest wanted to hear. They spoke of pride, envy, anger, or lust. But no matter how many sins were named, the cravings continued. Families left with lighter hearts, convinced they had cleansed the soul, but the body still demanded laudanum. The separation between sin and sickness was not yet understood. For the addict, the weight of guilt only added to the misery. Some monasteries took harsher approaches, believing that the suffering was caused by demons or by weakness of spirit. Monks used punishment as treatment. Addicts were whipped, locked away in cold cells, or forced to fast for days. These practices were described as purification, as attempts to drive out evil, but they only left addicts more broken. Hunger weakened them further, cold left them shivering, and pain added to their torment. No demon left their bodies. No healing appeared. The only thing driven out was the last remnants of dignity, compared to modern times, where medical care seeks to support and reduce harm. The medieval use of physical punishment shows how ignorance could turn treatment into torture. Many priests and monks simply did not know what to do. They had no understanding of dependence, no knowledge of how laudanum altered the body and mind. Faced with behaviors they could not explain, some withdrew entirely. They told families to take the addict home, to endure quietly, to accept that this was God's will. In this way, the church often abandoned those who needed help most. Families left the stone halls with no answers, carrying their suffering back into their homes, where nothing had changed. The promise of salvation through faith had turned into silence and neglect. The disappointment was heavy. Families had believed so strongly in the power of the church. They had trusted that priests could heal what ordinary people could not. To see nothing change, or to watch their loved ones punished instead of helped, left them shaken. Some continued to return, clinging to the hope that persistence would eventually bring healing. Others gave up, realizing that the church offered nothing but words and rituals, but few spoke openly of their disappointment. To question the church was dangerous, so they carried their doubts in silence, pretending faith even as their hope faded. Addicts themselves often grew resentful. They endured the prayers, the confessions, and the punishments, but none of it brought peace. Many left monasteries more bitter than before. They no longer believed in the rituals, but they had no alternative. Some mocked the priests under their breath, others simply withdrew into silence. They accepted the laudanum again as soon as it was offered, confirming that no ritual could replace the drug. The bottle remained their true refuge, even as it destroyed them. Faith could not compete with craving. What strikes me most is the cruelty hidden inside these failures. I cannot help but reflect on how people turned to the holiest places they knew, only to be met with punishment, neglect, or false hope. The silence of the church in the face of such suffering feels heavier than the suffering itself. For addicts and their families, It must have been like standing at the gates of heaven and finding them locked. The trust they placed in faith was met with emptiness. The failure of the church and monastery did not mean the end of the story. Families and addicts continue to survive, each in their way. With no institution to help, they turned inward. Addicts learned to adapt, to deceive, to carry their dependence in secret. They became skilled at hiding bottles, skilled at lying, skilled at pretending. What the church failed to cure, the addict learned to conceal. This secrecy became another chapter in the long and painful history of laudanum use, one that pulled families deeper into silence and shame. And so, when prayer and punishment failed, when priests and monks gave nothing but words, the addict turned back to themselves. They learned to live a double life, presenting one face to the world and hiding another in the shadows. As laudanum's grip tightened, addicts became skilled at concealing their dependence. The failures of family, church, and community taught them that open suffering brought only shame or punishment. To survive, they had to hide. They learned to carry the bottle close, tucked into folds of clothing, wrapped inside garments, or slipped into pouches that no one would notice. Women often concealed it beneath the layers of their skirts. Men carried it inside their tunics or tucked it into their belts. The bottles became like secret companions, never far from reach, always ready to provide a moment of relief. Hiding the drug was as important as consuming it. Excuses became another tool of survival. Addicts found ways to step aside from daily life under believable pretenses. They claimed they needed fresh air, that they had errands, that they felt unwell. Each excuse offered a chance to slip away and take a hidden drink. Families grew used to these small absences, rarely questioning them directly. The pattern became familiar, yet few dared to confront it. Silence and denial protected the household from gossip, even as everyone knew the truth. The addict perfected these routines until they blended seamlessly into daily life. Lies became second nature. Addicts denied how much they used, denied where the bottles came from, and denied that they suffered at all. They insisted they only took laudanum when truly needed. They swore they could stop at any time. They looked into the eyes of their families and spoke these falsehoods as though they believed them. Over time, the act became effortless. Lies slipped from their tongues as easily as breath. The line between truth and falsehood disappeared, leaving only survival. It is almost sarcastic that people who once trusted laudanum as holy medicine became masters of deceit, hiding the very thing they had once displayed proudly. This deception required constant effort. Addicts watched the eyes of others, careful not to reveal too much. They practiced steady hands, calm voices, and convincing smiles. They learned how to cover the smell of the drug, how to hide the glassy look in their eyes, and how to change the subject when questions came. Every social interaction became a performance, every moment an act of control. The drug ruled their bodies, but secrecy ruled their lives. Without secrecy, the drug would be taken away. Without the drug, the suffering would return. Concealment was the only path left. Families sometimes played along. They pretended not to notice missing time, hidden bottles, or false words. They accepted the excuses, avoided confrontation, and allowed the lies to continue. Part of this was denial, part was fear, and part was love. They did not want to lose their loved ones to shame or gossip. They thought silence was protection, though it was really surrender. The addict's skills grew sharper because no one challenged them. Every lie unspoken, every bottle ignored, strengthened the pattern of concealment. Families became part of the act, even when they wished otherwise. Communities, too, turned a blind eye. Neighbors suspected, but few dared to speak directly. They saw the excuses, the sudden absences, the strange behaviors. They whispered among themselves, but they rarely confronted the addict or the family. Open accusations carried risk. It was easier to ignore the truth and pretend not to see. In this silence, addicts thrived in their secrecy. They became ghosts within their villages, present but unseen, suffering but hidden. Their skills in deception allowed them to move through life without direct confrontation, even as everyone quietly knew. The longer this deception lasted, the more it shaped their identity. Addicts no longer knew where their true selves ended and their false selves began. The lies became habits, the excuses became instinct, their lives were lived in halves, one part hidden and one part displayed. The hidden part controlled everything, but the displayed part kept the world at bay. This division drained them of energy, leaving them weary and hollow. Yet they continued, because the alternative was exposure, and exposure meant shame and punishment. Compared to modern times, when addiction is often confronted openly in families or treated with structured programs, the medieval addict survived by deception, learning that lies were safer than honesty. Their world offered no support, no guidance, and no compassion for the truth. Concealment was not only survival, but the only strategy they had. Lies became their shield, even as the drug became their cage. The act of hiding created new dangers. Bottles sometimes broke in secret places, revealing their presence. Addicts risked injury or discovery each time they slipped away. Families lived with the constant tension of pretending not to notice, while fearing that neighbours would notice first. The entire structure of secrecy was fragile, held together by fear and silence. When it cracked, the results were harsh. Gossip spread quickly, judgment fell heavily, and the addict was marked even more strongly as cursed or sinful. Concealment could never last forever, but it remained the only path addicts knew. What strikes me most is how exhausting this double life must have been. I cannot help but reflect on how every smile, every excuse, every word carried the weight of concealment until life itself became one long performance. The addict's true self was buried beneath endless layers of lies, not because they wished to deceive, but because the world gave them no other choice. This exhaustion added to the burden of addiction, leaving them weaker each day. Despite the exhaustion, many addicts became experts at hiding. They fooled families, neighbours, and even themselves. They clung to secrecy as fiercely as they clung to laudanum. Concealment was survival, and survival was all they had left. Yet the cost of this survival was heavy. They lived in constant fear of discovery, in constant need of lies, in constant exhaustion from performance. Their lives were no longer their own. They belonged to the drug and to the secrecy that protected it. And in this secrecy, some of them began to rely not on family or community, but on the pity of strangers. Their survival shifted from deception alone to the mercy of others, who provided just enough to keep them alive. By the time laudanum had consumed their strength and stripped them of dignity, some addicts survived only through the pity of others. They no longer worked the fields, no longer held steady positions, no longer provided for their families. Their bodies were too weak, their minds too restless, and their hands too unsteady. Hunger pressed against them daily, and the craving for laudanum never left. To endure, they begged. They walked to markets, stood near churches, or lingered by the gates of wealthy homes, asking for food or for coins. Their words were often soft, sometimes incoherent, but their meaning was clear. They survived not by their effort, but by the mercy of those willing to give. Some people pitied them enough to provide scraps of food. Others gave small coins, not enough for comfort, but enough to keep them moving. Sometimes they offered bread in one hand and laudanum in the other, believing both were necessary. Families too poor to help still gave a little, hoping charity would protect them from judgment or curses. Addicts learned to rely on these small gestures, moving from one source of pity to another. Each day became a search for kindness, a routine of waiting, asking, and hoping that someone would give enough to last until tomorrow. Small tasks also became a way to survive. Some addicts offered labour in exchange for food or for drops of laudanum. They gathered firewood, cleaned yards, or pulled weeds from gardens. Their work was slow, clumsy, and inconsistent, but pity often outweighed usefulness. People hired them not because they were needed, but because they could not turn them away completely. A bottle or a few coins was given as payment. The addict accepted with gratitude, then quickly sought laudanum. The cycle repeated endlessly, with pity serving as the bridge between dependence and survival. It is almost sarcastic that people who once stood as farmers, workers, or even respected figures became reduced to pulling weeds for a sip of the very drug that destroyed them. In some cases, wealthier individuals took in addicts. Nobles, merchants, or members of the clergy sometimes supported them, offering food, shelter, or money. The reasons varied. Some did it out of compassion, others out of curiosity. A few even treated it as entertainment, observing the strange behaviours of addicts as though they were spectacles. For others, it was a quiet indulgence in pity, a way to feel virtuous while watching another person decline. Addicts who found such patrons were kept alive, but their survival was fragile and humiliating. They were not respected guests, but tolerated dependents. Life under pity carried its suffering. Addicts felt the weight of humiliation every day. They knew they had become burdens, that their survival depended not on their strength but on the kindness or curiosity of others. Pride was stripped away, replaced with quiet desperation. Families suffered too, embarrassed to see their loved ones begging or performing menial work for scraps. Children watched their parents lowered in the eyes of the community, their dignity gone. The shame clung to everyone in the household, even those not addicted. Survival came at a high cost, one that deepened the pain already caused by laudanum. Some addicts justified their dependence on pity. They told themselves that it was temporary, that they would recover, that the kindness of others was part of God's plan. Others sank into despair, accepting pity as the only path left. Their lives became a string of small mercies, never enough to restore them, always enough to prolong the suffering. They lived in half-light, never fully abandoned, never truly saved. Each day ended with the same conclusion: they could not live without others, and they could not live without laudanum. Pity sustained them, but it also trapped them in the same endless cycle. Compared to modern times, when support systems and treatment programs exist to address addiction, the medieval addict had only the unpredictable mercy of individuals, leaving survival to chance rather than structured care. Charity was uneven, unstable, and often tinged with judgment. Some received enough to last, others received nothing. There was no guarantee of survival, only the hope that someone would show kindness. Dependence on pity meant dependence on uncertainty, a fragile existence that could collapse with one refusal or one absence of compassion. The addict's role in society shifted completely. Once contributors, they became symbols of decline. Their presence reminded others of weakness, sin, or curses. Some people avoided them, refusing to give. Others mocked them, laughing at their trembling hands or desperate words. Pity was not universal. It was selective, unpredictable, and often cruel. To live this way was to exist at the edge of society, tolerated but never embraced, fed but never respected. Every gift carried with it the reminder that they could not survive on their own. What strikes me most about this stage is the quiet humiliation hidden inside it. I cannot help but reflect on how living from pity must have crushed every sense of worth, turning strong men and women into shadows who survived only because others allowed them to. The pain was not only physical or mental, but deeply social, erasing dignity and leaving only dependence. To see a parent, a spouse, or a neighbour reduced to begging or performing meaningless work must have weighed heavily on entire communities. Survival itself became another form of suffering. And yet, this survival mattered. Pity, however inconsistent, kept many addicts alive longer than they would have managed on their own. It stretched out their lives, even if those lives were filled with suffering. For some, It allowed enough time to pass their habits on to their children. For others, it simply prolonged the inevitable. But in every case, pity carried them further along the same path of decline, pulling families and communities with them. Their survival was not their achievement. It belonged to the strangers, neighbours, and nobles who chose to keep them alive. As their survival depended more on pity, their children grew up in homes marked by weakness and shame. These children watched every moment, learned every pattern, and carried the weight of their parents' decline into their futures. Children who grew up in homes marked by laudanum addiction carried burdens heavier than most could imagine. They were not raised with steady hands to guide them or strong arms to protect them. Instead, they lived in households filled with silence, tension, and decline. The ordinary duties of parenting were abandoned. Addicted mothers and fathers could not provide proper care. Meals were irregular, discipline was absent, and affection was scarce. The home, which should have been a place of learning and comfort, became a place of confusion and fear. No one taught these children how to work the fields with patience or how to manage the small duties of daily life. Instead, they had to learn on their own or rely on neighbours when possible. Many grew up hungry, sometimes stealing food to fill empty stomachs because their parents had sold what little remained for laudanum. The absence of guidance left them wandering through childhood without structure. Their schooling, if it existed at all, was neglected. The focus of the household was not on their growth but on the next bottle. Their futures were shaped by this neglect long before they became adults. The scenes they witnessed were even more damaging. Children saw their mothers writhing in agony during withdrawal, crying out in the night, or begging for more of the drug. They saw their fathers collapsed in corners, pale and trembling, unable to rise. These memories sank deeply into their minds. Night after night, they watched the people who were supposed to protect them break apart before their eyes. The noise of screams, the sight of shaking hands, and the endless bottles hidden in clothing became their education. Childhood innocence was stolen, replaced with images of suffering they could never forget. It is almost sarcastic that a drug praised as a healer left behind generations of children whose only lesson in life was how to watch their parents slowly destroy themselves. The emotional weight of these experiences shaped their characters. Some children grew hardened, distrustful of others, and unwilling to believe in promises. They learned early that adults could not be relied upon. Others grew fearful and withdrawn, carrying anxiety into adulthood. Their lives were marked by shame, as the community whispered about their families and distanced themselves from the home. Children were blamed for the sins of their parents, carrying stigma they had not earned. They were excluded from gatherings, avoided by other families, and sometimes bullied by peers. The suffering of addiction extended beyond the addict to poison the very lives of their children. Without proper care, many of these children fell ill. Malnutrition weakened them, exposure to cold or unsanitary conditions sickened them, and the lack of supervision left injuries untreated. Some died young, never escaping the weight of the household they were born into. Those who survived carried scars that lasted long after their parents were gone. They grew into adulthood with broken health, broken trust, and broken spirits. Their chances of building stable lives were limited from the start. Addiction created not just broken individuals but broken generations. Compared to modern times, when social workers, schools, and healthcare systems can step in to protect children from neglect, medieval children had no such shield. There were no safety nets, no institutions to catch them when their families collapsed. They bore the full brunt of their parents' addiction with no relief, no protection, and no recognition. Their suffering was invisible, hidden inside homes that communities already preferred to ignore. The damage was accepted as fate rather than treated as a preventable tragedy. Some of these children repeated the same cycle. Having grown up in homes where laudanum was ever present, they became familiar with its uses and effects. They knew where to find it, how to consume it, and how it numbed pain. When their own suffering came, whether from grief, injury, or despair. They reached for the same bottle their parents had once clung to. The cycle of dependence passed from one generation to the next, quietly sustained by familiarity and desperation. The sins of the parent became the burdens of the child, not through blood alone, but through experience and example. Others swore never to follow that path. They rejected laudanum, turned away from it completely, and carried bitterness toward the substance for the rest of their lives. Yet even they were shaped by it. Their rejection was not freedom but reaction. Their choices, their fears, their anxieties all grew out of the same soil of suffering. They were never untouched. Whether they repeated the cycle or resisted it, laudanum defined them. Its shadow followed them, shaping their lives in ways they could never escape. What strikes me most about these children is their silence. I cannot help but reflect on how they carried their memories alone, too young to understand them, too powerless to change them, and too ignored by society to be heard. Their pain was invisible, tucked away behind the walls of homes already marked by shame. No chronicler recorded their voices, no priest spoke their stories, and no healer recognized their needs. They suffered quietly, growing into adults who carried the weight of childhoods lost to addiction. The damage did not remain within single households. Entire communities felt the weight of children growing up neglected and broken. They became adults who struggled to work steadily, who mistrusted others, who repeated cycles of poverty and despair. Villages weakened when too many families fell into decline. Productivity fell, trust collapsed, and social ties frayed. The impact of laudanum spread outward, not only through individual suffering but through the collapse of community strength. The cost of addiction was measured not only in lives but in the weakening of entire regions. The children of addicts remind us that suffering never stays in one body alone. It spills outward, touching everyone nearby, reshaping families and breaking futures. In medieval times, no one understood this truth, and so the cycle continued unchecked. Children became adults shaped by laudanum, carrying scars and habits they did not choose. Their lives were proof that addiction did not end with the addict but lived on through generations. And yet, even in this ongoing cycle, death eventually came. The addicts who raised these children rarely lived long, their bodies too weakened and their minds too broken to endure. And when death arrived, it often came quietly and alone, leaving children behind with nothing but memories of suffering and the scars of neglect. The lives of laudanum addicts in medieval times often ended in silence. There was rarely a moment of recognition, no gathering of mourners, and no sense of closure. Their deaths came quietly, without warning, often in the same corners where they had spent their final years. Families did not always notice immediately. Some addicts lay still for hours before anyone realized that the shallow breathing had stopped. The signs were simple, the body unmoving, the eyes open but unseeing, the skin pale and cool. There was no grand event, only the final stillness of a life consumed by dependence. The cause of death was never certain. Families and neighbours rarely connected the passing to laudanum itself. They said it was a fever, weakness, or some unknown sickness. Priests sometimes called it punishment from God or the result of a curse. There were no physicians to record a clear reason, and there was no understanding of how the drug had slowly destroyed the body. To those left behind, the addict simply slipped away, another life lost without explanation. Their decline had lasted for months or years, and their death was seen as the natural end of suffering. In truth, it was laudanum that had taken them, but no one wrote those words. The sight of death carried its horror. Families found their loved ones lying motionless, eyes wide open as though frozen in one final moment of fear or longing. The image unsettled those who saw it, making death feel unnatural, even though it had long been expected. Some closed their eyes quickly, hoping to erase the disturbing expression. Others avoided the body entirely, leaving it untouched for hours out of fear. The silence of the moment was heavy, broken only by whispers and hurried prayers. There was no dignity in these deaths, only unease. Burial practices reflected this fear. In some cases, bodies were laid to rest quietly, with small prayers and little ceremony. Families buried them quickly, eager to move past the shame. In other cases, the fear of curses or evil spirits led to even greater haste. Some bodies were carried out at night, placed in shallow graves before dawn, as if secrecy could protect the living from contamination. Neighbours sometimes refused to attend, unwilling to risk the presence of what they called dark forces. It is almost sarcastic that a drug once praised as a divine gift left its victims buried in silence, as if their very bodies carried danger into the soil. The shame of addiction followed even into death. Families often avoided speaking of it, inventing other causes when asked about their loss. They said it was a sudden sickness, or that the person had been weakened by long labour. The truth of laudanum was erased in these stories, leaving only vague explanations. Children were told little, and neighbours pretended to believe. Silence became the final act of concealment, hiding the role of the drug even as the grave covered the body. The addict's true story disappeared with them, unspoken and unrecorded. Communities, too, played a part in this silence. They treated the deaths as ordinary, even when the suffering had been obvious. They did not question, didn't reflect, and did not connect the pattern from one addict to another. Each death was treated as an isolated event, never as part of a wider problem. This denial allowed the cycle to continue. As long as the truth remained unspoken, laudanum kept its hold, and new victims continued to fall. The deaths of addicts served as warnings, but no one admitted it. The silence ensured that the lesson was never learned. For the families, grief was complicated. They felt sorrow for the loss, but also relief that the suffering had ended. The cries, the tremors, the endless desperation were gone, leaving behind a quiet that was both welcome and haunting. Some felt guilt for their relief, ashamed that death had brought them peace. Others felt anger, blaming the addict for weakness or for bringing shame to the household. Grief was tangled with emotions that could not be spoken openly. Mourning was done in silence, without the rituals or expressions that marked other deaths. Compared to modern times, when medical records and death certificates document causes clearly, the medieval addict disappeared without a trace, their deaths swallowed by ignorance and silence. No one studied the body, no one investigated the cause, and no one asked whether the drug itself was responsible. The absence of understanding erased not only the reason but the possibility of prevention. Death was seen as fate, unchangeable and unquestioned. The opportunity to recognize a pattern was lost again and again. The loneliness of these deaths cannot be overlooked. Many addicts died apart from others, lying in corners, fields, or barns. Families sometimes kept their distance in the final hours, fearful of the strange behaviors or the imagined spirits. Friends and neighbors avoided visiting, leaving the addict to face death alone. Even when someone sat nearby, the silence remained heavy, the distance unbridgeable. The addict's final moments were marked not by comfort but by solitude, reflecting the isolation that had defined their lives for so long. What strikes me most about this stage is the absence of acknowledgement. I cannot help but reflect on how entire lives ended without anyone naming the truth, leaving only silence where compassion or understanding should have been. The addict was erased not only by the drug but by the community that refused to speak of it. Their deaths were not remembered as tragedies but dismissed as ordinary. The silence was perhaps the cruelest part, ensuring that nothing was learned, nothing was shared, and nothing was changed. And so, their deaths passed quietly into the background of history. No records were kept, no lessons drawn, and no voices raised. They disappeared into the earth with little more than hurried prayers and uneasy glances. The laudanum that had consumed their lives consumed their memory as well, leaving nothing but silence. Families moved on, neighbours forgot, and the world pretended they had never existed. Yet this silence did not erase the truth completely. Whispers remained. Stories passed quietly from one mouth to another, tales of strange deaths and hurried burials. These fragments never reached the pages of history, but they lingered in memory, shaping how people thought about sickness and sin. And in these whispers, one fact became clear: addicts left no trace in the official records, their suffering erased as though it had never happened. The deaths of laudanum addicts in medieval times faded quickly into silence. After the hurried burials, after the whispers in the village, nothing remained. The chroniclers who filled manuscripts with details of wars, plagues, and famines rarely wrote about addiction. The suffering of ordinary people enslaved by a drug was not considered worthy of ink or parchment. Their stories disappeared before they could be told. No monuments were raised, no records were kept, and no lines in history books carried their names. They were lost to time as though they had never lived at all. When deaths were noted, they were described only in vague terms. Parish registers and village records sometimes included words like strange illness or unknown weakness. These labels hid the truth. Families did not dare admit that laudanum was involved, and priests did not know how to describe what they had seen. So the cause was disguised, turned into something ordinary, something acceptable. Benla, or strange sickness, was the phrase most often used. It allowed communities to bury the shame along with the body. In this way, the addict's story ended not only in silence but in deliberate erasure. The decision to forget was not accidental. Society preferred to ignore what it did not understand. To acknowledge addiction would have meant admitting weakness within the community, admitting that a trusted medicine could destroy lives, admitting that suffering existed without explanation. These were truths people did not want to face. It was easier to call it a sin, a curse, or a mystery. It was easier to turn away. By pretending that addicts died of ordinary illnesses, the community protected its pride, but it also condemned others to repeat the same cycle. It is almost sarcastic that chroniclers filled entire pages with the deaths of kings and nobles, while ignoring the slow destruction of countless ordinary people. The absence of records created the illusion that addiction was rare. Without written evidence, later generations assumed it had not been a serious problem. They believed laudanum was used only as a medicine, never as a cause of widespread suffering. Archaeologists and historians had to piece together fragments centuries later to guess at what had really happened. But the voices of the addicts themselves were long gone. The silence of the past was almost complete, leaving only faint traces in oral stories or in the unspoken memories of families. The addicts were erased twice, first by death and then by history. Compared to modern times, when addiction is studied, recorded, and debated in medical journals and public reports, the medieval silence feels like a second punishment. Today, the struggles of addicts leave behind data, records, and even advocacy, making their suffering visible to others. In the past, their struggles vanished the moment the grave closed. The difference is striking. What was once forgotten entirely is now analysed in detail. But for those who lived and died in medieval times, the absence of acknowledgement meant their suffering ended without witness. This erasure also shaped how future generations remembered laudanum. Without records of its dangers, people continued to view it as medicine for centuries. The belief in its healing power endured, strengthened by the silence of the past. Families who had lost members to addiction rarely spoke of it, passing down stories only in whispers, if at all. The cycle of forgetting allowed the cycle of use to continue. Laudanum's reputation remained untarnished in official records, even as it destroyed lives in private. The truth was hidden not only from neighbours but from history itself. The silence protected institutions as well. The church, which had failed to help, did not want reminders of its powerlessness. Nobles who had supported addicts out of pity or curiosity preferred not to be connected to shame. Physicians, few though they were, did not want to admit that the remedies they prescribed could harm, so no one recorded the truth. Silence was safer for all, except for the addicts who had lived and died with no one to defend their memory. Their absence from history was not a mistake. It was a choice made by those who preferred comfort over truth. What strikes me most is how complete this silence became. I cannot help but reflect on how people lived entire lives of torment, yet not a single honest line was written about them, leaving their existence hidden as though it was shameful even to remember. Their absence from records was not only an erasure of suffering, but an erasure of humanity itself. To be forgotten so completely is to die twice, once in the body and once in memory. The cruelty of this silence is as striking as the suffering of addiction itself. The addicts of medieval times left behind no chronicles, no diaries, and no letters. They did not have the means to record their own lives, and no one else thought it worthwhile. Their homes crumbled, their graves went unmarked, and their stories vanished. What little remains comes from hints in religious texts, scattered medical notes, or archaeological evidence of damaged bodies. The rest is gone, erased by the silence of a society unwilling to face the truth. The addicts became invisible, their suffering hidden behind vague words and deliberate forgetfulness. Yet silence cannot erase everything. Whispers survived, passed down in families, transformed into rumours and superstitions. People spoke of strange deaths, of illnesses that lasted too long, of unrested spirits. These fragments, though distorted, carried hints of the truth. The addicts themselves were not remembered, but their suffering left faint shadows in memory. It is through these shadows that later generations can guess at what was lost. But the addicts never received the dignity of honest remembrance. Their erasure remained almost total, leaving their lives swallowed by time. And so, history turned the page without them. Wars, kings, and battles filled the manuscripts, while the addicts disappeared. Their absence left no space for learning, no warnings for future generations, no acknowledgement of the suffering that had occurred. The silence of the past ensured that the cycle of laudanum continued unchallenged, spreading its shadow for centuries. The addicts became ghosts, not only in life but in memory, erased from the very fabric of history. Yet, even in the midst of this silence, there were those within the church who secretly fell to the same dependence. Their stories were not told openly, but behind the monastery walls, bottles of laudanum were hidden, used, and guarded in secret. Not all laudanum addicts in medieval times were peasants, workers, or nobles. Some of them were monks and priests who lived inside the very institutions that condemned others for weakness. Behind stone walls and locked wooden doors, bottles of laudanum were hidden. These men of faith discovered that the same drug that tore apart families could also give them calm. In moments of prayer, when minds wandered or exhaustion weighed heavily, they turned to laudanum for focus. A few drops brought silence to restless thoughts. A larger measure carried them into a heavy stillness that they mistook for peace. They believed they had found a tool to aid devotion, not realizing they had stepped into the same cycle as the people they judged. The secrecy was deliberate. Laudanum was not spoken of in sermons or confessions. Instead, it was tucked away in small bottles behind shelves, beneath beds, or within personal trunks. Monks who preached about discipline and purity drank in secret before entering the chapel. Priests who advised families to trust prayer sipped quietly in their chambers. They called it a holy medicine, a gift that steadied their hands and cleared their minds for divine service. In their words, it was not weakness but devotion. They disguised dependence with piety, convincing themselves and sometimes others that their use of laudanum was different from that of common people. The storage of laudanum became almost ritualistic. Some monks accumulated small collections, keeping bottles hidden in corners or wrapped in cloth. They treated it with reverence, referring to it as sacred or as a remedy for spiritual distraction. The drug became part of their daily rhythm, as predictable as the ringing of bells or the recitation of psalms. When its effects dulled, they increased the measure. When withdrawal came, they told themselves it was a trial sent by God. It is almost sarcastic that men who condemned peasants as weak for turning to laudanum excused their dependence as holy discipline. The pattern spread quietly within certain monasteries. Not every monk partook, but those who did recognized each other by small signs: a slower step, a distant gaze, or the faint smell of alcohol from the opium mixture. They shared bottles discreetly, never openly. Their vows of poverty did not prevent them from obtaining it, since laudanum was cheap and accessible. Some even used donations from villagers to secure their supply. To outsiders, their devotion looked steady, but behind closed doors, their prayers were often drug-induced, their stillness chemically enforced. The contradiction was striking, though carefully hidden, compared to modern times, when scandals in religious institutions are exposed by investigations and spread quickly through newspapers or social media. The secrets of medieval monasteries remained locked within stone walls. There was no system to uncover them, no voices brave enough to challenge them, and no records to reveal the truth. The addicts among the clergy lived and died in secrecy, their dependence erased by the silence of their order. Their use of laudanum became another hidden chapter, unspoken in public and forgotten in history. This secrecy affected the communities they served. Villagers who turned to priests for guidance never knew that the calm authority they saw was often sustained by laudanum. Sermons delivered with solemn voices sometimes came from men half numbed by the drug. Advice given to grieving families was shaped by minds dulled by dependence. Yet the community trusted them, believing their authority came from faith and study rather than from a bottle. The irony deepened: those who condemned addicts also relied on the same drug to maintain their image of strength. Inside the monasteries, laudanum also created division. Some monks disapproved, suspecting that their brothers were relying on something unholy. Whispers circulated in cloisters, though rarely spoken aloud. Discipline within monasteries varied. In some places, the abbot ignored what he suspected, unwilling to confront the issue. In others, punishments were handed down if bottles were discovered, though the punishment was often silence or exile rather than true correction. The drug remained present, even if disapproved. Dependence was too strong to erase, and secrecy too deep to reveal. What strikes me most about this hidden use is the self-deception involved. I cannot help but reflect on how men who dedicated their lives to truth and honesty managed to lie most effectively to themselves, convincing their hearts that laudanum was not a weakness, but a divine test. This deception insulated them from guilt, allowing dependence to flourish. They did not see themselves as addicts, but as chosen souls enduring a trial. The reality was simpler. They were trapped like everyone else, only with the added burden of pretending otherwise. Their secrecy ensured that their stories disappeared as completely as those of ordinary addicts. No chronicles recorded monks addicted to laudanum. No confessions described priests numbed by opium. Instead, their lives were remembered in the same way as their peers, as pious men devoted to prayer and service. The drug's role was erased, hidden behind the reputation of the institution. This silence preserved the image of the church while burying the truth of individual suffering. The monk's dependence blended into the larger silence surrounding laudanum, another hidden thread in a tapestry of denial. Yet even in silence, these men shaped the story of laudanum in subtle ways. Their secret use reinforced the idea that it was acceptable, even holy, under the right circumstances. Their calm, their authority, and their devotion, when influenced by laudanum, presented an image of the drug as beneficial. Without intending to, they strengthened its reputation, giving it legitimacy in the eyes of others. Their hidden dependence contributed to the slow acceptance of laudanum as something more than medicine, something embedded in the spiritual as well as the physical lives of medieval people. And so, even within monasteries, laudanum lived quietly in bottles hidden from sight, numbing not only bodies but consciences. These men of faith carried their dependence until the end, never confessing, never recording, and never remembered for what they truly were. Their lives became another silent testimony to the power of laudanum and the depth of denial in medieval society. Yet the silence did not last forever. Over time, as more people died and more whispers spread, the perception of laudanum began to change, though slowly and reluctantly. The perception of laudanum in medieval times did not change quickly. For years, it was treated as a common medicine, trusted by both villagers and nobles, prescribed by priests, and whispered about by families. Even when some people began to suspect that it caused more harm than good, they rarely said so openly. To question laudanum was to question a tradition that had become part of daily life. Those who doubted often kept silent, fearing ridicule or disbelief. The habit of trust was too strong, and the silence of history made it easy to pretend that nothing was wrong. Only when the number of deaths grew too obvious to ignore did whispers begin to spread. Families who had lost loved ones started to share stories quietly with neighbours. They spoke of relatives who wasted away, of strange behaviours, and of sudden deaths that no one could explain. These conversations rarely happened in public, but in kitchens, in barns, or behind closed doors. The truth began as a rumour. As fear passed from one household to another, people were careful not to speak too loudly, yet the doubt spread, carried by grief and repeated by experience. A quiet awareness began to replace blind trust, though it moved slowly. The church and local leaders resisted these whispers. They continued to describe laudanum as a gift, as a cure for suffering, and as a medicine blessed by God. They did not want to admit failure, nor did they wish to abandon something that had become so deeply rooted in their practices. Families also hesitated because admitting laudanum's danger meant admitting complicity in the deaths of their own. The shame was too heavy, and so silence continued. The perception of laudanum shifted only when the evidence of suffering grew undeniable. By then, many lives had already been lost. Even then, the change was incomplete. People could not abandon laudanum entirely. They recognized its danger, but they also remembered its relief. They whispered warnings even as they reached for the bottle. They told each other to be careful, but continued to take it when grief, pain, or despair became too heavy. The drug still gave comfort, and comfort was hard to resist. This contradiction shaped the slow change in perception. Laudanum was both feared and desired, condemned and embraced. Families lived with this tension, caught between doubt and dependence. It is almost sarcastic that even as laudanum's dangers became undeniable, people clung to it as though it were the only friend they had left. The contradiction extended across communities. Some villages treated laudanum as poison, speaking of it only in warnings. Others continued to use it freely, ignoring the whispers. These differences created divisions, with some families refusing it entirely and others defending it as necessary. This uneven perception reflected the slow pace of change. Knowledge did not spread quickly, and silence remained powerful. Even as warnings grew, denial persisted. The shift was never sudden, but always hesitant, pulled forward by grief and held back by habit. Compared to modern times, when information about harmful substances spreads rapidly through science, media, and public debate, the medieval shift was painfully slow, carried only by whispers and personal stories. There were no newspapers to expose the danger, no physicians to record patterns, and no governments to enforce laws. The truth was carried only by word of mouth, fragile and unreliable. It took years for suspicion to build into recognition, and even then, recognition did not lead to action. The slow pace allowed laudanum to maintain its hold for generations. For those already addicted, the shift in perception made little difference. They continued to use laudanum, regardless of warnings. Their bodies demanded it, and no amount of fear could overcome the craving. Families sometimes tried to intervene, but they rarely succeeded. Dependence was too strong, and the drug too accessible. Even as people whispered of its dangers, addicts clung to it. They defended their use with simple words, claiming it was the only thing that kept them alive. Some said openly, "I cannot live without it." In their eyes, the danger was irrelevant compared to the relief. This contradiction between fear and use created a strange reality. Communities recognized the problem but failed to address it. Families whispered warnings but continued to enable dependence. Priests condemned addiction but sometimes used the drug themselves. Everyone knew the truth in pieces, but no one admitted it fully. The slow change of perception left society caught in limbo, aware of the danger yet unable to act. The result was continued suffering, hidden beneath layers of denial and hesitation. What strikes me most about this stage is the stubbornness of silence. I cannot help but reflect on how people could watch death after death, whisper their doubts, and still hesitate to admit the truth aloud, as if speaking it would make the suffering too real. The slow change in perception was not only about ignorance, but also about fear. To admit laudanum's danger was to admit years of mistakes, to accept responsibility for countless deaths, and to face a future without the comfort it provided. The weight of this truth was too much for many to carry, so they chose hesitation instead. The slow change also deepened divisions in families. Some members swore off laudanum completely, while others continued to rely on it. Arguments broke out quietly, with warnings ignored and pleas unanswered. The drug split households just as it split communities, creating rifts that never fully healed. Change did not bring unity, but further division. The slow pace ensured that suffering continued, prolonged by hesitation and silence. And yet, even in this slow change, the consequences grew clearer. Families weakened, communities declined, and the burden of addiction spread beyond individuals. Small villages that had once thrived began to collapse under the weight of lost labor, wasted money, and broken households. The recognition of laudanum's danger came too late to prevent these consequences, and the slow pace of change made recovery almost impossible. When a person in a small medieval community became dependent on laudanum, the effects never stopped with the individual. The family carried the weight first. The loss of labor was immediate because the addict could no longer work fields, tend animals, or manage household duties. Someone else had to take on those tasks, often children or aging parents. The work was done less efficiently. Crops suffered, animals were neglected, and the family's stability weakened. At the same time, what little money or goods they had was drained by the constant need for laudanum. The purchase of medicine became the purchase of survival, and soon the purchase of despair. Families that had once managed to live with modest comfort sank into poverty. Tension grew inside households. Spouses argued about money, about responsibility, about shame. Children suffered from neglect, hunger, or the burden of labor too heavy for their age. The addict became a source of conflict as much as a source of sorrow. Neighbors watched and judged, whispering behind closed doors, while the family endured humiliation openly. Life inside those homes was marked by stress that never lifted. The addict's craving ruled the rhythm of every day, shaping meals, work, and sleep around the bottle. The family was trapped, unable to escape, yet unable to function as before. When several people in the same village were addicted, the damage multiplied. A small community relied on every able hand, and the loss of even a few workers made a difference. Fields went untended, harvests were lighter, and trade slowed. The community as a whole began to feel the weight of the drug. Tensions rose between families, with some blaming others for weakness or sin. Gossip filled the air, dividing people who once supported each other. The strength of the village weakened as its members struggled privately with the same burden. A cycle of decline spread outward from the addict to the entire community. It is almost sarcastic that something praised as a cure drained villages of strength faster than famine or war. leaving them weaker not by force of arms but by small bottles passed hand to hand. The irony was not recognized at the time, but its effects were plain. Villages declined quietly, not from visible destruction but from the slow erosion of labor, trust, and health. The damage was subtle yet devastating, and no one had the words to describe it. Addiction was not understood, so people saw only weakness and sin, not the true cause. The community collapsed from within, while the drug continued to spread. Compared to modern times, when governments recognize addiction as a social problem requiring policies, programs, and resources, medieval communities faced it alone, with no knowledge and no support. There were no institutions to intervene, no aid to soften the blow, and no recognition of the larger pattern. Each family suffered in isolation, believing their burden was unique, when in truth it was shared by many. Without understanding, no cooperation arose, and without cooperation, no solution was possible. The silence around laudanum prevented collective action, ensuring that the decline of one family became the decline of the whole community. The economic impact was severe. Villages lived close to survival, with little margin for loss. When workers were lost to laudanum, the balance tipped quickly. Poverty spread, hunger followed, and desperation deepened. Families sold animals, tools, or land to sustain the habit, leaving themselves unable to recover even if the addict died. The cycle of decline was financial as well as personal. What little wealth existed drained into bottles, leaving communities poorer, weaker, and less stable with each passing year. The burden of laudanum was not only in lives lost but in livelihoods destroyed. Social ties frayed as well. Communities that once shared labor, food, and celebrations began to divide. Families with addicts were avoided or whispered about, and trust eroded. Cooperation in planting, harvesting, or defending the village weakened. Suspicion replaced solidarity. Those without addicts resented those with them, believing they carried unnecessary burdens. Those with addicts resented their neighbors for turning away in judgment. The unity that small communities relied on dissolved slowly, leaving everyone more vulnerable. Addiction not only breaks families but also the bonds that hold villages together. What strikes me most about this stage is the depth of silence. I cannot help but reflect on how communities watch themselves weaken year after year without ever speaking honestly about the cause, as if naming it would make the problem too heavy to bear. The refusal to admit the truth was as damaging as the addiction itself. By hiding behind vague words like illness or weakness, they lost the chance to act together. Each family suffered alone, and each community suffered in silence. The silence protected pride but destroyed strength, leaving villages hollowed out by an unspoken enemy. The decline continued across generations. Children raised in homes marked by laudanum grew into adults who carried the scars of neglect and poverty. Some repeated the cycle, seeking the same relief their parents had sought. Others rejected it, but carried the weight of childhood shaped by loss. Villages became poorer not only in the present but in the future, as each generation carried forward the damage of the one before. Addiction left its mark not through records but through decline, weakening families and communities in ways that could not be measured, but could always be felt. Over time, some villages never recovered. Too many families collapsed, too many workers were lost, and too much wealth drained away. The communities faded, absorbed into others or left behind as ruins. Their names disappeared from records, their existence erased by silence and decline. Laudanum's role was never acknowledged, but its shadow remained. The villages that vanished carried with them the unspoken truth addiction could destroy not only individuals but entire communities, and it did so quietly, without battles or disasters, leaving only absence behind. And so, while laudanum was first seen as medicine and later whispered about as a danger, its full impact was felt most heavily in the decline of small communities. The burden of one addict became the burden of all, stretching from families to villages until entire regions weakened. No one recorded the truth, but the ruins and absences told the story. Addiction was not remembered in history books, but it lived on in the hollow spaces it left behind. Yet even as communities collapsed, the addicts themselves slipped further into obscurity, erased not only from records but from memory, until the last of them disappeared into time itself. The last laudanum addicts of the medieval world vanished slowly and quietly. Their lives had already been marked by silence, and their deaths followed the same path. They left no written records, no carved stones, no diaries hidden in trunks. They did not belong to the class of people whose names were preserved by scribes or remembered in chronicles. They were peasants, small traders, servants, or forgotten members of households. Their absence was easy for history to accept. As the years passed, they were erased not only from life but from memory itself. They disappeared into the stream of time as though they had never been born. In their final days, their families no longer spoke openly of their suffering. Shame and exhaustion had silenced the household long before death arrived. When the addict's body grew too weak to rise, relatives provided only the smallest care, food placed by the bed or water left nearby. Some families withdrew almost completely, tired of endless cycles of collapse and begging. The addict's last moments were often spent in isolation, surrounded by walls and silence. When death came, it was expected. There were no tears of surprise, only the weary recognition that the struggle was over. The burials were brief, sometimes hurried, and often without witnesses beyond the immediate family. A few words were spoken, a cross perhaps placed above the soil, and then the matter was finished. Records, if they existed at all, listed vague phrases such as illness, weakness, or strange condition. No one wanted to write opium or laudanum. No one admitted the truth. The shame of dependence remained so strong that even in death, the addict's life was covered over with lies. It is almost sarcastic that a substance once praised as a miracle ended with victims buried quickly, remembered as nothing more than curiosities of illness. As generations passed, even those small memories dissolved. Families did not tell stories about their addicted relatives. Parents avoided the subject, children forgot, and grandchildren never knew. Villages moved on, and the addicts became nameless. They were not preserved in songs or tales, only occasionally recalled in whispers about strange deaths or cursed lives. In many cases, the last evidence of their existence was the poverty their families carried forward. Broken farms, lost land, or weakened bloodlines spoke silently of their absence. But the people themselves were gone, swallowed by silence and time. The disappearance of addicts from history books was not accidental. Chroniclers filled pages with accounts of battles as plagues and kings, but they never found space for the suffering of ordinary people. Addiction was considered shameful, unworthy of record, and better forgotten. The result was a deliberate erasure. Laudanum's victims did not vanish only because of time, but because of choices made by those who wrote history. Their lives were judged too small to matter, their suffering too uncomfortable to preserve. The silence of scribes and priests ensured their erasure, compared to modern times, when records, studies, and testimonies preserve even the smallest details of addiction. The medieval silence seems almost cruel, leaving no trace for future generations to understand. Today, addicts are counted, studied, and remembered. Their struggles are written into medical journals, legal cases, and family histories. But in medieval times, none of this existed. The addicts were reduced to nothing the moment they died. The contrast is sharp, showing how completely their existence was erased. Without records, they became invisible to the world. Yet the consequences of their lives did not vanish. Families weakened by addiction carried their scars into the future. Children who grew up neglected repeated patterns of despair. Villages that had lost labour and wealth never fully recovered. The addicts were gone, but the damage remained. Their absence was felt in the fields left fallow, in the homes left in disrepair, and in the mistrust that lingered among neighbours. Time erased the names but not the consequences. Addiction's shadow stretched further than the lives it consumed, leaving behind a decline that lasted for generations. For those final addicts, disappearance into silence was a second death. The first was physical, the second was memory, with no records, no stories, and no recognition. Their existence became meaningless to the world around them. They did not achieve even the dignity of being remembered as cautionary examples. Their lives ended as if they had never mattered. I cannot help but reflect on how terrible it must be to vanish not only from life but from remembrance, to suffer so much yet be erased so completely. This fate, perhaps more than the suffering itself, was the cruelest punishment of all. Some whispers did survive, but only as fragments. People spoke of the man who wasted away, the woman who saw visions, or the child who grew up strange. These words carried traces of addiction, though never openly. They were transformed into superstition, warnings told around fires, or excuses for misfortune. The addicts themselves were gone, replaced by myths and fears, their humanity dissolved, leaving behind only rumour. This was the final stage of their erasure, to be remembered not as people, but as shadows, stripped of identity and story. The last addicts of medieval times became invisible. They did not appear in books, their graves were unmarked, and their families chose silence. They were consumed by time, forgotten by history, and erased by shame. Only their impact remained, hidden in the weakness of families and the decline of villages. Their suffering echoed forward, though no one spoke their names. They were gone, but the shadow of Laudanum continued, reaching into later centuries when others would repeat the same mistakes, unaware of those who had come before. Their disappearance leaves us with a final truth. Addiction in medieval times was not only a matter of personal suffering but also of memory denied. By erasing their stories, society ensured that their pain served no purpose, taught no lesson, and offered no warning. Their lives ended twice, once in the body and once in history. The silence around them was chosen, and that silence shaped the future. They are gone, but the cost of their lives can still be felt in the way laudanum continued to spread long after they were forgotten. And so the story ends with emptiness. The addicts were swallowed by time, leaving nothing behind but silence and consequence. History turned the page without them, and the world forgot. But forgetting does not erase the truth. The truth remains, carried in the ruins of families and villages, and in the lessons we can still see if we look closely enough. The addicts are gone, yet their absence speaks. It tells us how easily lives can vanish when silence replaces truth. This has been the story of laudanum in medieval times, told in fragments that history tried to erase. Thank you for staying until the end of this long journey. Sleep well, and may your night be calm. Good night.